Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The farmhouse exhaled dust and memories when I pushed open the front door, its hinges groaning like old bones settling into familiar aches. 3 days. That's all the time I had to catalog Uncle Harold's belongings before the estate auction swept away 40 years of accumulated life. The realtor had been clear about the timeline, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against her clipboard as she explained the market pressures, the need for quick turnover, the way old properties like this one hemorrhaged money with each passing day. I hadn't been back since Harold's funeral 6 months ago, and the intervening seasons had transformed the once pristine interior into a museum of neglect. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight that slanted through windows filmed with grime, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the familiar rooms feel alien. The floorboards beneath my feet announced each step with protests that seemed to echo longer than they should, as if the house itself was commenting on my presence. The master bedroom drew me like a magnet, though I couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the journalist in me, always seeking the story behind the story, or maybe just morbid curiosity about how a man spends his final years. Harold's writing desk dominated the far corner, its mahogany surface scarred with decades of use but still possessing an undeniable dignity. I remembered sitting beside him as a child, watching his weathered hands carefully clean his target shooting medals, each one representing another victory in competitions that had defined his retirement years. The desk drawers slid open with surprising ease, revealing the expected detritus of a solitary life. Unpaid bills, faded photographs, prescription bottles with labels that spoke of heart medication and failing eyesight. But it was the absence that caught my attention, a rectangular outline in the dust where something had been removed recently. The metal cases. Harold had always kept them locked in the secure car safe, a paranoid habit that had amused the family, but which he'd insisted was necessary for items of such sentimental value. Night fell earlier than I expected, or perhaps I'd simply lost track of time amid the overwhelming task of sorting through Harold's possessions. The house's electrical system, installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration, cast pools of amber light that seemed to struggle against encroaching shadows. I'd claimed the master bedroom for my temporary stay, reasoning that the attached bathroom and proximity to Harold's most personal belongings would make the cataloging process more efficient. The lamp on the writing desk flickered as I prepared for bed, its bulb buzzing with the irregular rhythm of impending failure. I made a mental note to find replacement bulbs in the morning, though the thought carried an odd weight, as if this simple domestic task might somehow prove more challenging than anticipated. I discovered the metal case at 2:47 a.m. Sleep had been elusive, punctuated by the house's nocturnal symphony of settling wood and distant traffic. Thirst finally drove me from bed, and as I padded toward the kitchen, a metallic gleam caught my peripheral vision. There, centered perfectly on Harold's desk, sat the largest of his metal cases, the one I distinctly remembered seeing locked away in the car safe just hours earlier. The case lay open like a jewelry box, its red velvet interior revealing the carefully arranged collection of Harold's shooting medals. But it was the smell that stopped me cold, the acrid, unmistakable scent of gunpowder, fresh and sharp in the stale air of the bedroom. My rational mind immediately began constructing explanations. Perhaps Harold had cleaned his medals with some chemical that retained its odor, or maybe the case had absorbed decades of range visits. But these thoughts felt thin, inadequate against the evidence of my senses. I approached the desk slowly, bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The lamp's buzz grew more pronounced with each step, its light developing an irregular pulse that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. When my fingers finally touched the case's edge, the bulb flickered violently and died, plunging the room into darkness, so complete it felt tangible. The whispers began immediately, soft at first, barely distinguishable from the white noise of blood rushing through my ears, but growing clearer with each passing second. A voice I almost recognized spoke in measured tones about breathing techniques, sight alignment, trigger control, The fundamental lessons every marksman learns. The words seemed to emanate from the case itself, though reason insisted this was impossible. I snatched my hand away and the whispers stopped. The lamp flickered back to life, revealing the case exactly as I'd found it, metals gleaming innocently in their velvet beds. But the gunpowder smell lingered, now accompanied by something else, the faint metallic taste of fear coating the back of my throat. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours until dawn researching Harold's competitive shooting career on my phone, diving deep into local newspaper archives and Veterans Association websites. What I found painted a picture of moderate success. Regional competitions won, state-level participation, the steady accumulation of bronze and silver medals that suggested dedication rather than exceptional talent. But there were gaps in the timeline, periods where Harold's name disappeared from competition rosters for months at a time. The most significant absence occurred during 1987 and 1988, when he'd apparently stopped competing entirely before returning with a dramatic improvement in his scores. His marksmanship had transformed during those missing months, evolving from competent to exceptional in ways that prompted speculation among local shooting enthusiasts about special training or coaching. The second night brought dreams that felt more like memories belonging to someone else. I stood in a dimly lit basement range, the concrete walls absorbing the sharp crack of gunfire. Harold was there, younger and more vital than I'd ever known him, his eye pressed to a rifle scope as he adjusted his aim with mechanical precision. But something was wrong with the targets. Instead of the standard bullseyes, they bore faces I couldn't quite make out, photographs that seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them. I woke to find the metal case open again, positioned precisely where I'd discovered it the night before. This time, however, one medal was missing. A silver disc Harold had won at the state championships in 1989. The empty velvet depression where it should have rested seemed to throb in the lamplight, drawing my attention with an almost magnetic pull. The missing medal turned up in the kitchen, sitting beside the coffee maker like a forgotten piece of morning routine. As I picked it up, the metal felt unnaturally cold against my palm, and the engraved text seemed to shift under my fingertips. The date read 1989, but the competition name had changed. Instead of state championship, the words now spelled out service rendered in the same elegant script. I blinked hard and looked again. The medal had returned to normal, displaying the familiar championship inscription I'd seen countless times during childhood visits. But doubt had taken root, a creeping uncertainty about the reliability of my own perceptions that made me question everything I thought I knew about my uncle's past. The third day arrived with a phone call from the auction house confirming the next day's schedule. As I listened to the coordinator's efficient rundown of procedures and timeline, I found myself staring at Harold's desk, trying to reconcile the mundane details of estate liquidation with the increasingly surreal experiences of the past 2 nights. Research consumed my morning. Hidden in a shoebox beneath Harold's bed, I discovered a collection of newspaper clippings that painted a more complex picture of his life than I'd ever imagined. The articles were decades old, their edges yellowed and brittle, covering a series of unsolved crimes that had plagued the county during the late 1980s. Break-ins, vandalism, threats against local officials, a pattern of harassment that had terrorized the community before abruptly ending in 1989. One clipping featured a group photograph of volunteers who had assisted police with surveillance and security during that period. Harold stood in the back row, his face serious and unfamiliar, despite the unmistakable features. The caption identified him as a community asset who had provided specialized expertise during the investigation. But it was the final clipping that made my hands shake as I held it. A brief article celebrating the resolution of the harassment campaign, noting that the perpetrator had been permanently discouraged from continuing his activities through community intervention. No arrests were mentioned. No trial. Just the quiet notation that the problem had been solved through unofficial channels. That evening, as I prepared to spend my final night in the house, the medal case appeared once more on Harold's desk. This time, all the medals were present, but they'd been rearranged into a new pattern, forming a circle around a small, tarnished brass bullet that I'd never seen before. The gunpowder smell was overwhelming now, so strong it made my eyes water and my throat burn. I reached for the bullet, compelled by a curiosity that felt both urgent and dangerous. The moment my fingers made contact, the lamp died and the whispers returned. But now they carried Harold's voice with unmistakable clarity. He spoke about justice delayed, about loose ends that required tying, about recognition that needed to be withdrawn before it could bring shame to the family name. The auction, I realized with growing horror, would put Harold's medals on public display. Collectors would examine them closely, research their provenance, potentially uncover connections between Harold's shooting achievements and activities that had occurred during those missing months in his competition record. Whatever service Harold had rendered in 1989, whatever permanent solution he'd provided to the community's harassment problem, the evidence of his involvement lay embedded in the medals themselves, if someone knew how to look for it. As the whispers faded and the lamp flickered back to life, I understood what Harold wanted me to do. The bullet disappeared from the center of the metal arrangement, but its message remained clear. Some achievements were never meant for public recognition. Some stories needed to stay buried beneath the veneer of legitimate glory. I spent that final night carefully removing every reference to 1989 from Harold's shooting records, editing newspaper clippings with surgical precision, erasing the evidence of that transformative period in his marksmanship career. The medals themselves I returned to their case, noting how they seemed to settle into their velvet beds with an almost audible sigh of relief. The auction proceeded without incident the following day. Harold's medals drew modest interest from collectors, selling for exactly their expected market value to buyers who saw only the accumulated achievements of a dedicated hobbyist. No one questioned the gaps in the timeline. No one noticed the careful editing of the historical record. But as I drove away from the farmhouse for the final time, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than necessary, watching for signs of pursuit that never materialized. The taste of gunpowder lingered on my tongue for weeks afterward, and I developed an unconscious habit of listening for whispers in quiet rooms. I never discovered whether Harold's late-night visits were real or the product of exhaustion and suggestion, whether the medals actually rearranged themselves, or my sleep-deprived mind simply played tricks on my perception, whether that basement range from my dreams existed anywhere other than in my imagination. What I do know is that some family legacies are too dangerous to preserve intact. Some stories require careful curation to protect both the living and the dead, and sometimes, the most important service we can render to those we've lost is ensuring that certain achievements remain forever uncelebrated, their true significance known only to the shadows where they were earned. The metal case now sits in my apartment, locked away in a drawer I rarely open. On quiet nights, when the city noise fades to a distant murmur, I occasionally catch the faint scent of gunpowder drifting through my bedroom. But I've learned not to investigate these anomalies too closely. Some conversations with the dead are better left unfinished, some whispers better left unheard. After all, there are worse things than uncertainty. Sometimes the most merciful gift we can give ourselves is the luxury of doubt. Story 2. The brass key felt heavier than it should have as I turned it in the ornate lock of the Meridian Gallery. Marcus had insisted the place practically ran itself. Just check the security system twice daily, water the plants, and keep an eye on the climate control. Easy money for a skeptical programmer between contracts, he'd said with that nervous laugh of his before disappearing on his European acquisition trip. The Victorian mansion's conversion into a contemporary art space should have been jarring, but somehow the stark white walls and industrial lighting felt more unsettling than harmonious. Maybe it was the way shadows pooled in corners where original crown molding met modern fixtures, or how the ancient floorboards creaked complaints beneath the weight of steel sculptures and canvas installations. I spent the first 2 days establishing routines, familiarizing myself with the security codes and the building's temperamental heating system. The centerpiece dominated the main hall, a towering abstract sculpture of twisted bronze and glass that seemed to shift depending on the viewing angle. Marcus had mentioned it was the gallery's prize acquisition, though he'd grown oddly evasive when I'd asked about its provenance. The metallic sound started on the third night. I'd been debugging code on my laptop in the small office overlooking the main hall when the first clang echoed through the building. Sharp, deliberate, like someone dropping a wrench on concrete. The security system showed green across all zones, but something about the quality of that sound made my skin crawl. Metal striking metal, but with an organic undertone that suggested flesh somewhere in the equation. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I descended the stairs, each step producing groans from wood that had settled for over a century. The main hall stretched before me, bathed in pale streetlight filtering through tall windows. Everything appeared normal until I reached the center of the room. The sculpture looked wrong, not obviously different, the bronze still twisted skyward in its familiar spiral, but something about its proportions seemed off, as if viewed through a funhouse mirror. I circled it slowly, trying to identify what had changed, when my peripheral vision caught movement near the far wall. The silhouette stood perfectly still, a void of absolute darkness against the white gallery wall. 7 feet of pure absence, as if someone had cut a human-shaped hole in reality itself. No features, no texture, just an oppressive presence that made the air feel thick and charged with static electricity. My hand trembled as I raised the flashlight, and in that moment between decision and action, I could swear the sculpture beside me was melting, bronze flowing like honey, glass elements sagging and warping. But when the LED beam finally pierced the darkness, the figure was gone. Only the smell remained, copper and ozone, like blood in approaching storms, and the footprints. Perfect impressions burned into the century-old hardwood, each step darker than charcoal and warm to the touch. The pattern led from where the figure had stood to the sculpture and back again, as if it had been examining the piece with scientific precision. I knelt beside the nearest print, noting how the wood around it remained untouched while the impression itself looked fresh, the burning so precise it might have been branded by a careful hand. Sleep became impossible. I installed motion sensors throughout the gallery, checked and rechecked the security footage, even called Marcus's hotel in Prague. The desk clerk informed me he'd checked out 2 days earlier than scheduled, leaving no forwarding information. The second night, the sounds began earlier. Scraping this time, like metal being dragged across stone. I found the figure standing closer to the center of the room, positioned between 2 oil paintings that depicted pastoral scenes with an unsettling intensity. The canvases themselves appeared different, colors more saturated, shadows deeper. In the painting to the left, what I'd remembered as a simple farmhouse now featured boarded windows and a door that hung askew on rusted hinges. When I blinked, the figure was gone, but the paintings retained their altered state. More footprints marked the floor, and I spent an hour photographing them with my phone, measuring their depth and spacing. Each print was identical in size and shape, suggesting the same entity, the same purposeful examination of the gallery's contents. But the temperatures were all wrong. The burned impressions radiated heat, while the surrounding air grew cold enough to fog my breath. I began researching the building's history during daylight hours, diving into public records and archived newspaper articles. The Meridian House had been built in 1887 by railroad magnate Edmund Meridian as a private residence. His wife, Catherine, had been an avid collector of art and curiosities from around the world. The house had remained in the family until 1963, when the last surviving heir donated it to the city with the stipulation that it be used for cultural purposes. The gap between 1963 and the gallery's opening 3 years ago remained frustratingly vague. Property records showed the building had been abandoned for decades, its contents sold at auction or simply left to decay. Marcus had purchased it in a state of near ruin and spent 2 years restoring it to its current condition. But restoration suggested returning something to its original state, and I was beginning to suspect the gallery's current incarnation was far from original. The third night, I positioned myself in the office with multiple cameras running and a clear view of the main hall. The scraping sounds began at 2:17 a.m., and this time I forced myself to remain perfectly still, observing without intervention. The figure materialized gradually, as if reality was slowly remembering its existence. First, a suggestion of depth against the wall, then a more solid presence, finally the full 7-foot outline of absolute darkness. It moved with purpose toward a series of photographs mounted along the east wall, stark black and white images of urban decay that Marcus had identified as an emerging artist's breakthrough series. As I watched, the photographs began to change. The abandoned buildings in the images grew shadows that writhed like living things. Empty windows filled with suggestions of faces. Graffiti-covered walls developed stains that looked disturbingly organic. The figure stood before each photograph for exactly 90 seconds before moving to the next. And with each examination, the images became more disturbing, more wrong. I forced myself to remain motionless until the entity completed its circuit and vanished, leaving behind its signature burned footprints and the lingering smell of copper and ozone. The photographs, when I examined them in daylight, appeared normal. But I'd learned not to trust daylight anymore. Research into the gallery's specific pieces proved more challenging. Marcus had been deliberately vague about provenance, and many items lacked proper documentation. However, I discovered that several pieces had been acquired from estate sales of long-closed institutions: a psychiatric hospital, a reformatory, a home for unwanted children. Each building had been demolished within the past 5 years, their contents scattered to dealers and collectors. The pattern was becoming clear, even if its meaning remained elusive. The fourth night brought the figure to within 10 feet of my position. I could feel its presence like a physical weight pressing against my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The sculpture that had drawn its attention on the first night began its melting transformation again, bronze flowing like liquid while glass elements stretched and warped into shapes that hurt to perceive directly. But this time, I saw what the sculpture was becoming. The twisted, abstract form was revealing itself as something far more specific. An amalgamation of human figures, dozens of them, pressed together in poses of anguish and desperation. Faces emerged from the bronze, mouths open in silent screams, hands reaching toward spaces that no longer existed. The glass elements formed tiers and fragments of broken mirrors, reflecting distorted images of rooms I didn't recognize. The figure observed this transformation with what felt like satisfaction, and I understood with growing horror that it wasn't destroying the artwork, it was restoring it, revealing what each piece had been before Marcus had acquired and cleaned them for gallery presentation. When morning came and the sculpture returned to its abstract form, I began packing. But the building wouldn't let me leave. The doors refused to open, electronic locks cycling through error messages despite showing green status on their displays. Windows that should have opened remained sealed, their mechanisms somehow fused. Even my cell phone lost signal the moment I stepped toward any exit, bars returning only when I moved back toward the center of the building. I was being kept here for a reason. The fifth night, the figure appeared directly in front of me. 7 feet of absence that somehow conveyed vast intelligence and terrible purpose. This close, I could perceive details that my mind struggled to process. The suggestion of features that existed in dimensions my eyes couldn't properly interpret. A sense of depth that extended far beyond the physical space the figure occupied. It gestured toward the office wall behind me, and I turned to find that the simple white surface had been replaced by a massive oil painting I'd never seen before. The canvas depicted the gallery itself, but as it had been decades earlier. Instead of contemporary art, the walls held portraits of people in various states of distress. The centerpiece sculpture was revealed in its original form, not a bronze abstract, but an actual arrangement of human figures, preserved somehow in their final moments of terror. In the painting's corner, barely visible in shadow, stood the familiar 7-foot silhouette. I understood then that I hadn't been hired to caretake an art gallery. I'd been brought here to witness the restoration of something that had been hidden, disguised, made palatable for modern consumption. Each piece in the Meridian Gallery was a fragment of something larger and far more sinister, a collection that had never been meant for public viewing. The figure extended what might have been a hand toward me, and I felt knowledge flowing into my mind like ice water through my veins. Images of the building's true history, of what had really happened in these rooms during the gap years between abandonment and restoration. The art that Marcus had so carefully acquired wasn't art at all. It was evidence. remnants of experiments and experiences that had been scattered and disguised to prevent anyone from assembling the complete picture. But the figure, the curator of this true collection, was patient. It had waited decades for someone to restore its exhibits properly, to reveal them in their original, authentic forms, and it had chosen me to be its assistant in this work. My hands began moving without my conscious direction, reaching for the laptop and beginning to type. Not my words, but a message that needed to be sent. Email addresses appeared in my mind. Art dealers, collectors, museum curators, all people who might be interested in rare acquisitions and previously unknown works. The figure watched approvingly as I typed invitation after invitation, each one carefully crafted to attract a specific type of collector. People who wouldn't ask too many questions about provenance, people who would be drawn to the unusual, the disturbing, the authentic. When the emails were sent, the figure began to fade, but I knew it would return. Every night, as more pieces of the true collection were restored to their original forms, as more visitors came to view and potentially acquire these rare finds. As the cycle continued, spreading the gallery's influence to new locations, new collections. I remain here now, no longer trying to leave. The figure and I work together each night, carefully restoring each piece to its authentic state. During the day when visitors come, everything appears normal, just another contemporary art gallery in a beautifully restored Victorian mansion. But late at night, when the building remembers what it truly is, we continue our work. The figure is patient with my questions, generous with its knowledge. It's teaching me to see beyond the disguises, to recognize the truth hidden within seemingly innocent acquisitions. Marcus sends postcards occasionally, always postmarked from different cities, always featuring art museums. I think he understands what he helped create here, what he helped preserve and propagate. The postcards never include a return address. I've stopped wondering whether the figure is real or a product of isolation and stress. The distinction has become irrelevant. What matters is the work, the restoration, the gradual revelation of truth that has been carefully hidden for far too long. Tonight, a new piece arrives, a seemingly innocent landscape painting acquired from an estate sale in Connecticut. But I can already sense what lies beneath its peaceful facade, waiting to be restored to its authentic form. The figure approves of my growing expertise. Soon, it suggests, I'll be ready for my own collection, my own gallery, my own carefully selected caretaker. The work must continue after all, and there's so much left to restore. Story 3. The first time I heard Marcus calling my name from the hallway, I was 3 espressos deep into debugging a particularly stubborn piece of legacy code. My apartment's layout is simple, a straight corridor connecting the living room where I work to the bedroom at the far end. Sound travels clearly through that space, which is why I immediately recognized his voice despite the impossibility of his presence. David. Hey, David, you there? The cadence was unmistakably Marcus, that slight upward inflection he used when he was about to share one of his terrible dad jokes during our morning stand-ups. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening to the silence that followed. The heating unit hummed its mechanical lullaby. Outside, traffic moved in waves along 5th Street, but no footsteps, no breathing, no secondary sounds that should accompany a human voice. I called back, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. The silence stretched, thick and expectant, until I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Isolation does strange things to the mind, and I'd been working from home for 8 months straight. Maybe my brain had simply conjured a familiar voice to break the monotony, but Marcus's voice returned 20 minutes later, this time closer to my bedroom. Remember that client who insisted on using Comic Sans for their enterprise dashboard? Man, that was wild. The reference was specific, recent, a project we'd laughed about just last week during our virtual coffee break. I checked our company's time tracking system, my pulse quickening as the data loaded. Marcus had clocked in at our downtown office at 8:47 a.m. and hadn't logged any remote time. According to the GPS coordinates automatically recorded by our security software, He was currently 23 miles away, probably sitting in his usual spot by the east-facing windows. I stood slowly, my chair creaking in protest. The hallway stretched before me, shadows pooling in the corners where the afternoon light couldn't reach. Each step felt deliberate, calculated, as though I was walking into a trap I couldn't see. The hardwood floor groaned under my weight, announcing my approach to whatever might be waiting. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just as logic dictated it should be. That evening, I decided to clear my head with a walking tour of the historic district downtown. The guide, an elderly woman with silver hair and an encyclopedic knowledge of local tragedies, led our small group through narrow streets lined with buildings that had witnessed a century and a half of human drama. She spoke in measured tones about the Great Fire of 1894, how it had consumed 3 city blocks before the volunteer firefighters could contain the blaze. "The sound of that inferno," she said, pausing in front of a restored brick building. Witnesses described it as a living thing, not just the crackling of wood and the roar of flames, but something more complex, like voices calling out in languages no one recognized. As she spoke those words, a metal door 10 feet to our left slammed shut with tremendous force. The sound cut through the evening air with the same rhythmic precision I'd heard in Marcus's voice that afternoon, a measured cadence that felt deliberately timed rather than accidental. I turned toward the door, my skin prickling. The building appeared unoccupied, its windows dark and empty. No wind moved through the still air. No person stood nearby who might have caused the sound. Yet the slam had been too forceful, too perfectly timed to be coincidental. The guide continued her narrative without acknowledging the interruption, but I noticed 2 other tour participants glancing nervously in the door's direction. Their expressions suggested they'd heard it too, though neither commented. We finished the tour in relative quiet, but my mind kept returning to that moment when past and present seemed to collide in a single explosive sound. Back in my apartment, I began to research. My background in systems analysis had taught me to approach problems methodically, to trace connections that might not be immediately obvious. If something was manipulating audio in my living space, there had to be a logical explanation, some kind of technological interference or acoustic phenomenon that could account for what I was experiencing. I started with the building's history. The apartment complex had been constructed in 1952 on the site of a former boarding house that had burned down in 1949. Before that, the land had been empty since the Great Fire of 1894, the same fire the tour guide had mentioned. City records showed that the original boarding house had been known for its unusual acoustic properties. Residents complained of hearing voices from rooms they knew to be empty, conversations that seemed to drift through the walls without any identifiable source. The pattern was becoming uncomfortably clear. I installed a digital audio recorder in my hallway and left it running continuously. For 3 days, nothing unusual appeared in the recordings. Then, on Thursday afternoon, while I was updating client databases, I heard my own voice calling out from the bedroom. "Marcus, did you finish that regression testing?" The words were mine, but I hadn't spoken them. I was certain of this because my mouth had been full of coffee when the sound occurred, and I could still taste the bitter liquid on my tongue. Yet there was my voice, clear and unmistakable, asking a question I'd posed during a video call 2 days earlier. I rushed to check the recorder. The device had captured the sound exactly as I'd heard it, complete with the same intonation and timing. But according to the audio analysis software I ran, the voice contained subtle inconsistencies, micro gaps and frequency anomalies that suggested it had been assembled from multiple sources, like a digital collage of my own words. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon intensified. I heard conversations between colleagues who'd never met, discussions about projects that had been canceled months ago, and laughter that seemed to echo from meetings I'd attended in person years before the pandemic forced us all remote. Each incident felt like someone was broadcasting fragments of my professional life back to me through speakers I couldn't locate. The building's other residents began exhibiting strange behaviors. Mrs. Chen from 4B started leaving notes under my door, asking if I'd been playing music late at night. The messages described melodies that sounded familiar, but couldn't be identified. Songs that seemed to shift and change whenever she tried to focus on them. Mr. Rodriguez in 3A mentioned hearing his deceased father's voice calling his name from the stairwell, speaking in the same gentle tone he remembered from childhood. I interviewed them separately, carefully, trying to determine if we were experiencing related phenomena. Each described audio events that felt personally significant, voices of family members, fragments of conversations from their past, sounds that seemed designed to evoke specific memories or emotions. The pattern suggested something was accessing our individual histories and using that information to create targeted auditory experiences. My investigation led me to the building's basement, where the original foundation stones from the 1890s boarding house remained visible beneath newer construction. The space felt different from the rest of the building, colder, denser, as though the air itself carried more weight. When I spoke aloud down there, my voice seemed to linger longer than physics should allow, creating subtle echoes that extended beyond what the room's dimensions could account for. I brought recording equipment to the basement and left it running overnight. The next morning, the device contained 47 minutes of audio that shouldn't exist. Conversations in multiple languages, some of which I recognized as English from different historical periods. Voices that seemed to overlap and interweave, creating a complex tapestry of human speech that spanned decades or possibly centuries. Buried within this cacophony, I found my own voice from childhood, speaking words I remembered saying to my grandmother when I was 7 years old. The conversation had taken place in her kitchen in Pennsylvania, thousands of miles from this building, in a house that had been demolished 15 years ago. Yet here was that moment, preserved and somehow accessible to whatever presence inhabited this space. The realization that something could access not just recent audio, but memories from any point in a person's life, filled me with a terror I'd never experienced. If this entity could retrieve sounds from across time and distance, what other information might it possess? What other intimate moments from my past might it choose to replay? I stopped sleeping in the bedroom and moved my mattress to the living room, closer to the front door. The hallway had become a conduit for these temporal audio fragments, and I couldn't bear the thought of lying defenseless while voices from my history whispered in the darkness. But even in the living room, I could hear them, conversations drifting from other apartments, snippets of dialogue that seemed to move through the walls like water through a sponge. The building was becoming a repository of human sound, a vast library of recorded voices that some unseen presence could access and manipulate at will. Each resident was unknowingly contributing to this collection, their daily conversations and phone calls and solitary mumblings being cataloged and stored for future playback. I considered moving, but the thought of leaving felt like abandonment, not just of my lease, but of the other residents who were experiencing similar phenomena. We were all trapped in this acoustic nightmare together, and fleeing might only spread the problem to a new location. What if this presence could follow? What if it had already learned to replicate our voices so perfectly that it could continue its work regardless of where we went? Last night I heard my mother calling my name from the hallway. She used the same tone she'd employed when I was young and had stayed out past curfew, a mixture of concern and exasperation that I hadn't heard in 20 years. But my mother had been dead for 8 years, and her voice shouldn't exist in any form that could be played back in my apartment. I sat in my living room, listening to that impossible voice call my name repeatedly, each iteration slightly different from the last. Sometimes her tone was warmer, sometimes more urgent. The variations suggested that whatever was generating these sounds had access to multiple recordings of her voice, or perhaps was capable of creating new combinations from existing fragments. The calls continued until dawn, and I realized that I was no longer certain which of the voices I'd been hearing were real and which were reproductions. If this presence could perfectly mimic the dead, how could I trust any audio I encountered? How could I be sure that the voice of my colleague calling from the office was actually him, and not some elaborate reconstruction designed to maintain the illusion of normal human contact? I am writing this account because I need to document what's happening before I lose the ability to distinguish between authentic and manufactured sound. The boundary between past and present, between memory and reality, is dissolving in this building. We are all becoming sources of audio data for something that views human speech as raw material to be collected, processed and redistributed according to its own incomprehensible logic. The most terrifying possibility is that this phenomenon is not isolated to our building. If this presence can access sounds from across time and space, if it can reach into the past to retrieve conversations that took place decades ago in distant locations, then nowhere is truly safe from its influence. Every phone call, every private conversation, every whispered secret might be subject to eventual playback by an entity that regards human communication as a vast database to be mined and manipulated. I'm still here, in my apartment, listening to the sounds that drift through the walls. Some are familiar, some are foreign, and some exist in the uncertain space between memory and nightmare. I can no longer trust my own ears, but I continue to listen, hoping to understand the rules that govern this acoustic haunting before it drives us all beyond the threshold of sanity. The voices are calling again now, from the hallway. This time, they sound like me. Story 4. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and emptiness when I first walked through its stark white rooms. After years of cramped studios cluttered with equipment and decades of accumulated memories, the minimalist space felt like stepping into a sensory deprivation chamber. 3 rooms, each painted in that clinical white that rental agencies favor, with hardwood floors that echoed every footstep like a hollow drum. The realtor had called it modern and clean, but standing there with my single suitcase and camera bag, I felt more like I'd entered a laboratory than a home. I'd needed the change. The divorce had stripped away more than just Sarah's belongings. It had taken the warmth from spaces, leaving behind rooms that felt haunted by what was no longer there. The minimalist approach wasn't a choice so much as a necessity. I simply couldn't bear to fill the emptiness with things that would remind me of what I'd lost. Better to embrace the void, I told myself. Better to start fresh with nothing but the essentials. The first week passed in a haze of establishing routines. My camera equipment claimed the largest room, 2 lights on stands, a backdrop, and my developing setup in what had once been intended as a walk-in closet. The bedroom contained only a mattress on the floor and a small dresser. The living area remained completely empty except for a single folding chair positioned near the window, where I'd sit in the evenings watching the city lights flicker on like stars being born. It was during one of these twilight vigils that I first noticed the shadow in my peripheral vision. At first, I dismissed it as an optical illusion, the kind of phantom movement that catches your eye when you're tired, when the brain fills in details that aren't quite there. Everyone experiences them. Shapes that seem to shift in dark corners, movement that stops the moment you turn your head. But this shadow felt different. It possessed a weight, a presence that seemed to press against the edges of my vision like something trying to break through from the other side of perception. The shadow always appeared in the same corner of the living room, where the wall met the ceiling at an angle that created a pocket of deeper darkness even during the day. The apartment's track lighting never quite reached that space, leaving it perpetually dim, like a wound in the room's bright geometry. I began to find myself glancing toward that corner more frequently, my eyes drawn there during the quiet moments when I was reviewing contact sheets or adjusting equipment. After 2 weeks, I became certain that something was standing there. The conviction arrived not through any dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of certainty that builds when you live alone and have nothing but your own senses to trust. The shadow had consistency, always the same height, roughly human in proportion, with what appeared to be a head and shoulders distinct from the formless darkness around it. It never moved when I looked directly at it, but I began to sense subtle shifts in its positioning when I wasn't paying attention, as if it were slowly, patiently adjusting its stance. I started carrying my camera more frequently around the apartment, initially telling myself it was to test different lighting conditions for potential shoots. But truthfully, I was hoping to catch something. The shadow remained stubbornly absent whenever I raised the viewfinder to my eye, as if it possessed an awareness of being observed through the lens that differed from simple, direct observation. The breakthrough came during a late-night editing session. I'd been working on a series of architectural photographs, long exposures that captured the geometric interplay of light and shadow in urban spaces. The computer screen provided the only illumination in the room, creating stark contrasts between the bright workspace and the surrounding darkness. As I adjusted the exposure on a particularly moody shot of an empty subway platform, I caught movement in the reflection of my monitor. There, inverted in the black glass of the screen, stood a figure that wasn't quite human. My breath caught as I stared at the reflection without turning around. The entity appeared to be constructed from photographic negative, translucent and granular, like an image printed on glass with too much grain. Its edges seemed to fluctuate between solid and gaseous, as if it existed in that liminal space between exposure and development. Most disturbing were the points of light scattered throughout its form, tiny bright spots that twinkled like distant stars embedded in its shadow flesh. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, afraid that any movement would cause it to vanish. The figure remained perfectly still, and gradually I began to notice that the points of light within its form weren't random. They formed recognizable patterns, constellations. Orion's belt stretched across what might have been its chest. The Big Dipper curved along its shoulder. Other patterns I couldn't immediately identify sparkled throughout its translucent body like a star map printed on human-shaped film. When I finally gathered the courage to turn around, the corner was empty. Sleep became elusive after that night. I found myself lying on the mattress, staring up at the ceiling and straining to hear sounds that never came. The entity, if that's what it was, moved in complete silence. Sometimes I would glimpse it in the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth, or catch its reflection in the curved surface of a lens cap. It was always there in the reflections, but never when I looked directly. I began photographing everything. The compulsion started small, a few shots of the empty corner during different times of day, different lighting conditions. I told myself I was conducting an experiment, trying to understand whether certain atmospheric conditions made the sightings more likely. But as days passed, the photography became more systematic, more desperate. I set up long exposures in every room, leaving the camera to capture hours of motionless darkness while I waited in other parts of the apartment. The first photograph that showed anything unusual appeared after a 6-hour exposure of the living room corner. Developed in my makeshift darkroom, the image revealed a faint impression in the area where I'd been seeing the shadow. Not quite a figure, but a disturbance in the grain structure of the film, as if something had been standing there exerting a subtle influence on the light itself. Each subsequent photograph revealed progressively more detail. The entity appeared to be gaining definition through the act of being photographed, as if the camera was somehow helping to manifest its presence in the physical world. The grain structure that formed its body became more organized, more intentional. The constellation points grew brighter and more numerous with each exposure. I developed the photographs with trembling hands, watching the images emerge in the developer like glimpses into another reality. The entity's star map body began to show patterns I recognized from astronomy textbooks. Entire galaxies spiraling within its torso, nebulae blooming across its limbs. It was as if I was photographing not just a figure, but a window into deep space, wearing the rough approximation of human form. The revelation that terrified me most came during the 3rd week of intensive photography. The entity was becoming more solid with each image. What had started as a barely perceptible disturbance in the film grain was evolving into something approaching photographic clarity. I could make out facial features now, or at least the suggestion of them, constructed from tiny points of light arranged in the approximate pattern of eyes, nose, mouth. I began to understand that I was trapped in a cruel paradox. Every photograph brought me closer to understanding what I was seeing, but it also seemed to be feeding the entity's manifestation. The more I documented it, the more real it became. Yet I couldn't stop photographing. The images were the only proof I had that I wasn't losing my mind, the only evidence that something genuinely inexplicable was occurring. My archive of negatives grew to hundreds of images. I organized them chronologically, creating a flipbook effect that showed the entity's gradual evolution from shadow to something approaching substance. The progression was undeniable. What had begun as random grain was becoming increasingly organized, increasingly intentional. It was while examining this chronological sequence that I made the most disturbing discovery. Hidden among my photographs of the entity were images I didn't remember taking. Shots of myself sleeping, taken from angles that would have been impossible unless someone, or something, had been moving my camera during the night. In these unauthorized photographs, I could see the entity standing over my sleeping form, its star body clearly visible in the camera's perspective, even though it remained invisible to my direct sight. The knowledge that it was photographing me while I slept shattered whatever remained of my rational explanations. I began checking the camera's memory card obsessively, finding new unauthorized images every few days. Always the same composition, me unconscious and vulnerable, with the entity looming nearby like a constellation-bodied guardian or predator. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom and moved to the living room chair, but the unauthorized photographs continued. The entity seemed capable of operating my equipment with increasing sophistication. Some images showed artistic composition, carefully framed shots that demonstrated an understanding of photographic principles I'd spent years learning. It was learning from me, absorbing my knowledge along with my image. The solution, when it finally occurred to me, was both obvious and devastating. I would have to burn the negatives. The logic was inescapable. If the photographs were somehow enabling the entity's manifestation, then destroying them might reverse the process. But the cost of this solution felt almost unbearable. Among those hundreds of negatives were years of work. Portraits of friends who had since moved away. Landscapes from trips I could never afford to repeat. Moments of beauty I had captured in fleeting instances that could never be replicated. More than that, burning the negatives would mean destroying the only evidence I had that any of this was really happening. Without the photographs, how could I prove to myself that I hadn't simply imagined the entire experience? The images were my anchor to certainty in a situation that had eroded my trust in my own perceptions. I spent days arranging the negatives in piles, trying to determine which ones I could bear to sacrifice. Some showed the entity clearly, others contained only subtle suggestions of its presence. But I gradually realized that the distinction might be meaningless. The entity seemed to exist in the spaces between what was photographed and what was perceived. It might be present in every image I'd taken since moving to the apartment, hiding in the grain structure like a virus in computer code. The night I finally decided to act, I loaded a metal wastebasket with negatives and carried it to the center of the living room. The entity stood in its usual corner, now visible even in my peripheral vision, a humanoid constellation that pulsed with gentle starlight. It seemed to be watching me with interest rather than alarm, as if curious about what I would do, rather than concerned for its own existence. I struck a match and held it over the basket, feeling the heat against my fingertips. The entity remained motionless, its star body twinkling with what might have been amusement. I realized that I had been thinking about this wrong. The photographs weren't creating the entity so much as revealing it. It had always been there, waiting in the dark corners and reflected surfaces. The camera had simply given me the ability to see what was already present. The match burned down to my fingers, and I dropped it into the basket. The negatives caught fire immediately, releasing an acrid smoke that stung my eyes and filled my nostrils with the chemical scent of burning memories. As the flames consumed my work, I watched the entity for any sign of change. It began to fade, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of disappearing, it became translucent, then transparent, as if it were stepping backward through layers of reality towards some dimension I couldn't perceive. The constellation points within its body grew dimmer but more numerous, multiplying like stars emerging as the sky darkens. Just before it vanished completely, the entity turned its head toward me. In that moment, I saw its face clearly for the first time. Not a face of flesh or shadow, but a face constructed entirely from points of light, arranged in the pattern of familiar constellations. Orion's belt formed its mouth. The Pleiades clustered where its left eye should be. Cassiopeia stretched across its forehead like a crown. As the last negative curled into ash, the entity smiled with a mouth made of stars and spoke a single word that I heard not with my ears but with something deeper, some organ of perception I hadn't known I possessed. Developed. The apartment fell silent except for the gentle crackling of dying embers. The corner where the entity had stood was empty, but somehow the darkness there seemed deeper than before, as if it retained the impression of something that had been standing there for a very long time. I sit here now in my folding chair, writing this account on a laptop whose screen reflects nothing but my own tired face. The developing equipment remains unused in the closet, my cameras gathering dust on their shelves. I haven't taken a photograph since that night 3 months ago, but sometimes I catch myself staring at dark corners, waiting for the telltale shimmer of grain and starlight. The most disturbing part isn't that I might have been experiencing hallucinations brought on by isolation and stress. The most disturbing part is that I've begun to suspect the opposite, that I was seeing something real, something that had been patiently waiting in the negative spaces of the world for someone with the right equipment and enough loneliness to make it visible. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the soft mechanical sound of a camera shutter clicking somewhere in the apartment. When I investigate, I find nothing, but I can't shake the feeling that something is still photographing me, building its own archive of images with equipment I can't see. I've thought about moving, but I've come to understand that it wouldn't matter. The entity wasn't bound to the apartment. It was bound to me, to my way of seeing, to the space between what exists and what is captured. It lives in the negative space now, in the gap between observation and documentation, waiting for the next person who spends too much time looking through viewfinders in empty rooms. Yesterday I found a new photograph on my phone, one I definitely didn't take. It shows me sitting in this chair, typing these words, with a faint constellation pattern visible in the window reflection behind me. The stars spell out letters if you know how to read them, forming words in a language made of light and shadow, still developing. I haven't decided yet whether to delete the image or print it. Part of me knows I should destroy it immediately, before it helps whatever is coming into focus achieve full manifestation. But another part of me, the part that has spent years trying to capture perfect moments in imperfect light, wants to see what it's becoming. The photographer in me is still curious about the final image, even if the human in me is terrified of what it might reveal. In Story 5. The first time it happened, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I'd been living in the converted loft for 3 weeks when the sound woke me. A soft, deliberate whoosh of wood against wood, followed by the whisper of fabric being shifted and rearranged. Through the industrial metal shelving that divided my sleeping area from the main space, I could see the silhouette of my dresser against the exposed brick wall. The top drawer hung open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. I lay still, listening to my pulse hammer against my pillow, waiting for the logical explanation to surface. Old building, warped wood, temperature changes. The drawer had simply slipped open on its own, the way drawers do in places with uneven floors and decades of settling. I'd noticed the apartment wasn't quite level when I'd first toured it. My drafting table required shims to keep my industrial design sketches from sliding toward the windows. But then came the second sound, the methodical rustle of cotton and wool being handled with surgical precision. I forced myself upright, feet finding the cold concrete floor. The industrial space stretched before me, all exposed ductwork and Edison bulbs casting harsh shadows across salvaged furniture. The metal shelving unit bisected the loft like a steel spine, creating the illusion of separate rooms while maintaining the raw, open aesthetic I'd fallen in love with. On the other side of that divide, something continued working in my dresser. By the time I rounded the shelving unit, everything was still. The drawer remained open, but my shirts hung inside with museum-quality precision, each garment equidistant from its neighbor, colors progressing from light to dark like a carefully curated display. The cotton blend button-downs I'd stuffed in haphazardly before bed now looked like they belonged in a high-end boutique. I stood there for several minutes, processing what I was seeing. My hands had definitely not arranged things this way. I remembered cramming the shirts inside just hours earlier, exhausted after a 14-hour day working on prototypes for a new chair design. I'd been living out of boxes for weeks, treating the dresser like a temporary storage solution rather than actual furniture. The drawer slid closed with a soft click, followed immediately by the next drawer down sliding open with the same deliberate motion. I stepped back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and watched my folded pants rearrange themselves with invisible hands. Jeans separated from khakis, casual from formal, wrinkles smoothed with the kind of attention I hadn't paid to my wardrobe since college job interviews. When that drawer finished its work and closed, the third one opened, then the fourth. Each one revealing clothes organized with retail-level precision, far beyond anything my scattered designer's mind could achieve, especially not while sleeping. I spent the rest of the night on my couch, staring at the dresser and jumping at every building-settling sound. By morning, I'd rationalized the experience into something manageable. Stress. I'd been pushing too hard on the chair project, staying up late, living on coffee and determination. The mind plays tricks when you're running on fumes. I'd obviously arranged the clothes myself in some sort of fugue state, maybe sleepwalking, maybe just so tired I'd forgotten doing it. The explanation felt thin, even as I constructed it, but I clung to it anyway. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. I threw myself deeper into work, sketching biomimetic furniture concepts that borrowed from nature's own engineering solutions. The loft's harsh industrial aesthetic actually helped my creative process. Something about the unfinished surfaces and exposed mechanics encouraged bold, unconventional thinking. I started staying later at my drafting table, partly because the work was going well, partly because exhaustion made sleep come easier. Then it happened again. And this time, I was watching. I'd positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the dresser, laptop balanced on my knees as I refined digital renderings of my latest prototype. It was just past 2 a.m. when the top drawer began its slow, deliberate slide. There was no mistaking the movement this time. Smooth, controlled, purposeful. Not the jerky motion of wood slipping against wood, but something that understood exactly how far to extend. What followed was a choreography of organization that belonged in a luxury department store. My clothes lifted and shifted as if manipulated by invisible hands, each piece considered, evaluated, and placed with mathematical precision. But it wasn't just about folding anymore. Colors were being arranged in gradients. Textures were being grouped by weight and weave. My casual weekend shirt found itself relocated to create better visual balance. The whole process took exactly 8 minutes. When the final drawer clicked shut, the dresser sat silent and perfect, more organized than it had ever been under my care. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Instead, I researched the building's history, diving deep into property records and old newspaper archives. What I found shouldn't have surprised me, but it sent ice through my veins anyway. The building had housed Torelli and Associates, master tailors, from 1952 to 1987. The business had been known throughout the city for impeccable craftsmanship and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Lorenzo Torelli, the founder, had built a reputation among the city's elite for creating suits that were architectural in their precision, every stitch measured, every angle calculated, every element contributing to a perfect whole. The newspaper articles painted a picture of artistic brilliance slowly curdling into something darker. Torelli had begun refusing clients whose bodies didn't meet his aesthetic standards. He'd remake completed suits if he discovered a thread out of place. Employees quit, unable to meet his increasingly impossible standards. The business had collapsed not from lack of skill, but from a perfectionism so consuming it devoured everything around it. The final article, buried in the obituaries section, mentioned that Torelli had been found in his shop surrounded by hundreds of unfinished garments, all cut and pinned but never sewn, as if he'd been unable to commit to completion, paralyzed by the possibility of imperfection. I realized I was living directly above what had been his main workshop. That knowledge changed everything. The nightly reorganization sessions continued, but now I watched them with a different understanding. This wasn't random supernatural activity. It was the continuation of work that had never been finished. The invisible presence organizing my clothes carried the same methodical precision I'd read about in those newspaper clippings. Every fold was considered. Every arrangement was intentional. But the activity was no longer confined to the dresser. I began finding my personal belongings rearranged throughout the loft. My drafting tools appeared on my work table each morning in order of size and function, despite my habit of leaving them scattered across the surface. My sketchbooks were stacked by project type, their pages somehow organized chronologically even though I'd filled them randomly. My prototype models, which I'd displayed haphazardly across shelves, were repositioned to create visual harmony. Heights balanced, materials grouped, colors flowing from warm to cool. The changes were always improvements, at least from a design perspective. My workspace became more efficient. My belongings achieved an aesthetic coherence I'd never managed on my own. But there was something unsettling about having your life curated by invisible hands, something that made me feel like a guest in my own space. I started testing the boundaries, making small messes before bed to see how far the reorganization would go. I'd scatter papers across my desk, leave books splayed open, set tools at odd angles. By morning, everything would be corrected. Not just organized, but arranged with the kind of spatial awareness that spoke to years of professional training. The presence was learning my habits, anticipating my needs, creating order from my chaos with an efficiency that bordered on precognitive. But when I began deliberately sabotaging the arrangements, turning hanging shirts backward, mixing formal wear with casual pieces, placing my prototype materials in aesthetically jarring combinations, something shifted in the nightly activity. The reorganization sessions grew longer, more insistent. I'd wake to find clothes not just arranged but rearranged multiple times, as if invisible hands were trying different configurations to achieve some impossible standard of perfection. My hidden belongings started appearing in the reorganization. Personal items I'd kept in boxes, prototypes I'd stored in closets, even things I'd forgotten I owned, all integrated into the growing display of systematic organization that was taking over my loft. The invisible presence wasn't just arranging what I used daily anymore. It was excavating my entire life, cataloging and displaying everything with museum-level curatorial intent. The sound changed too. What had been quiet, respectful rustling became more aggressive. Drawers opened with sharp snaps. Fabric was handled with quick, impatient movements. The careful 8-minute sessions stretched to 30 minutes, then an hour, with the presence working and reworking arrangements as if searching for a level of perfection that always remained just beyond reach. I stopped sleeping entirely, spending nights watching the increasingly frantic organization sessions from my couch. The invisible hands seemed to sense my observation, working faster when they felt my attention, slowing when I looked away. It was like being studied while studying something else, a feedback loop of mutual awareness that made the air in the loft feel thick and expectant. That's when I started finding things that weren't mine. Folded between my shirts were garments I'd never seen before. Suit jackets with hand-stitched buttonholes so precise they looked machine-made. Trousers with seams that appeared to have been measured to the millimeter. The fabric felt expensive, almost liquid under my fingers, but the styles were decades out of date. Everything carried the faint scent of old wool and pressing steam, as if it had been stored in a professional tailor shop for years. My prototypes were being joined by design sketches I hadn't drawn, technical drawings of clothing patterns with notes written in meticulous handwriting that wasn't mine. The sketches showed an understanding of form and function that paralleled my own furniture design work, but applied to garments with an obsessive level of detail that made my engineering drawings look casual by comparison. I researched deeper into Torelli's background, spending entire days in library archives and public records offices. What I discovered painted a picture of a man whose pursuit of perfection had gradually isolated him from every human connection. Former employees described working conditions that became increasingly unreasonable, measurements that had to be retaken dozens of times, stitching that was redone for flaws only Torelli could perceive. Customers turned away for minute physical imperfections that would compromise the theoretical perfection of his designs. The business records showed the progression of his isolation: fewer clients, longer completion times, more remakes, higher costs that drove away even his most loyal customers. But the most revealing documents were his personal notes, written in the same precise handwriting I was finding among my sketches. Perfection is not an achievement but a direction. Each stitch must serve the whole. Each measurement must honor the ideal. Compromise is corruption. Completion is surrender to imperfection. Reading his words, I understood that what was happening in my loft wasn't hauntings in any traditional sense. It was the continuation of work that had consumed someone so completely that even death couldn't stop the process. Torelli hadn't finished his pursuit of perfection. He'd simply run out of time, out of resources, out of people willing to enable his obsession. Now, he had me. The nightly sessions were no longer about organizing my belongings. They were about incorporating my life into a larger project, a continuing effort to create perfect order from the chaos of human existence. My clothes were being woven into a larger display. My design work was being studied and improved. My entire living space was becoming a canvas for someone else's vision of how things should be. And I was helping him. I began waking to find myself standing in front of the dresser at 3 a.m., holding clothes I didn't remember picking up, my hands positioned as if I'd been in the middle of folding. I'd discover my own sketches amended with notes in handwriting that looked like mine, but felt foreign under my pen. My design software showed revision histories I didn't remember creating, improvements to my prototypes that I must have made but couldn't recall making. The boundary between my work and Torelli's was dissolving. My design aesthetic was shifting toward his obsessive precision. I started measuring twice, then 3 times, then 5 times before making any cuts or modifications to my prototypes. I began redoing completed work because I'd noticed tiny imperfections that might not matter functionally, but violated some emerging sense of ideal form that felt both alien and increasingly natural. My client deadlines slipped as I spent more time perfecting details that would never be visible in the final product. I justified the delays as artistic growth, professional development, a necessary evolution toward higher standards. But late at night, watching my belongings rearrange themselves with surgical precision, I wondered if I was still making those choices, or if something else was making them through me. The loft was transforming around me. What had been a raw, industrial space was becoming something that resembled a high-end showroom. Everything positioned with mathematical precision. Materials grouped by quality and purpose. Lighting adjusted to create optimal display conditions. It was beautiful in a way that transcended normal aesthetic categories, but it no longer felt like a place where a human being could actually live. I was becoming a curator of my own life, driven by standards that exceeded anything I'd previously considered necessary or even desirable. But the work felt important in a way I couldn't articulate, as if I was participating in something larger than personal organization. A project that aimed to demonstrate how much better human existence could be if only someone cared enough to get all the details right. The rational part of my mind recognized this as dangerous territory. I was losing sleep, missing deadlines, alienating clients with my new insistence on impractical levels of perfection. But rationality felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the satisfaction of achieving perfect order, of creating spaces and objects that embodied ideal relationships between form and function. I stopped trying to disrupt the nightly reorganization sessions. Instead, I began participating actively, staying awake to observe and learn from techniques I couldn't consciously understand, but somehow felt compelled to absorb. The invisible presence seemed to welcome my attention, working more slowly when I watched, as if demonstrating proper methods for achieving the kind of perfection that had once driven a successful business into the ground. Last night, I found myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror at 4 a.m., holding scissors I didn't remember picking up, studying my reflection with the critical eye of someone evaluating raw material for a challenging project. My hair needed evening. My beard required more precise lines. My clothes, even perfectly organized, couldn't disguise the fact that my body itself was imperfectly proportioned for the aesthetic vision taking shape around me. I lowered the scissors without cutting anything, but I could feel the potential for improvement hanging in the air like unfinished work. There were so many details that could be adjusted, so many small imperfections that prevented me from achieving the same level of ideal form that governed everything else in my transformed living space. This morning I'm writing this account because I need to document what's happening while I still can. The distinction between my thoughts and Torelli's influence is becoming harder to maintain. I find myself thinking in terms of measurements and proportions, evaluating everything around me for opportunities to achieve better organization, more perfect arrangement, ideal relationships between all the elements of a life lived with proper attention to detail. The building management company called yesterday about renewing my lease. I told them I'd need to stay longer than originally planned. This project isn't finished yet. There's still so much work to do, so many improvements to make, so many ways to demonstrate what human existence could look like, if someone cared enough to get all the details right. I can hear the dresser drawers beginning to slide open, even though it's still daylight. The work is expanding beyond nighttime hours now, becoming a continuous process of refinement and improvement that doesn't pause for normal human schedules. I should be afraid. Some part of me knows I should be afraid. But when I watch my belongings arrange themselves with such perfect attention to form and function, when I see my living space transformed into something that approaches ideal aesthetic harmony, I feel only satisfaction and the growing certainty that I'm participating in work that matters more than anything I've ever attempted before. The scissors are still in my bathroom, lying across the sink edge with the precise placement that characterizes everything in my transformed loft. I haven't touched them since last night, but I know I will eventually. There are still imperfections to address, still details that could be improved, still opportunities to demonstrate what it means to pursue perfection with the kind of dedication that doesn't compromise or surrender or accept that good enough is good enough. Tomorrow, I'll begin working on myself with the same methodical precision that has transformed everything else in my space. After all, I'm the most important element in this display, and I deserve the same attention to detail that has made everything else in my life so much better than it was before. The drawers are opening faster now, and I can hear the whisper of fabric being handled with expert care. Time to watch and learn. There's still so much work to do. Story 6. The whistle pierced through my sleep again at 3:17 a.m., sharp and insistent, carrying the weight of rust and steam that had no business existing in my downtown apartment. I bolted upright, sweat-soaked sheets clinging to my chest, the phantom sound still echoing in the silence. The dream was always the same, had been since I was 7 years old, but the whistle was new, bleeding through from sleep into waking consciousness with increasing frequency. In the dream, I stand at the helm of a paddle-wheel steamboat, my hands gripping a worn wooden wheel that feels as familiar as my own heartbeat. Thick fog rolls across the water like gray cotton, muffling everything except the steady thump-thump-thump of the paddle wheel and the distant cry of something that might be a loon, or might be something else entirely. The river bends ahead, impossibly sharp, defying the laws of physics and navigation, but I always try to make the turn anyway. The boat groans, metal scraping against unseen rocks, and I wake just as the hull breaches and the cold water rushes in. For 26 years, I dismissed it as childhood trauma, manifesting in repetitive dreams. My therapist had suggested it stemmed from my father's stories about his own maritime service, though he'd been Navy, not riverboat trade. But lately, the whistle had begun following me into consciousness, haunting the edges of my waking hours like an insistent ghost. I worked as a guide at the Chesapeake Maritime Museum, a job that had fallen into my lap with unsettling ease. During my interview, I'd found myself correcting the curator about rigging techniques I'd never studied, explaining the intricacies of steam pressure systems I'd never encountered outside of dreams. My knowledge felt instinctive, emerging from some deep well of understanding that had no logical source. Visitors often commented on my expertise, asking where I'd learned to speak about 19th century vessels with such intimate familiarity. The truth was, I didn't know. 3 weeks ago, Dr. Margaret Holbrook, the museum's lead historian, had approached me with an unusual request. The museum had acquired the hull of the Evangeline, a steam-powered packet boat built in 1847 and abandoned in a Maryland creek for over a century. The restoration would be extensive, requiring someone with both technical knowledge and an intuitive understanding of period vessel construction. She'd chosen me, despite my lack of formal training in historical restoration. The Evangeline sat in the museum's restoration shed like a sleeping giant, her hull black with age and neglect. The moment I'd first laid hands on her weathered planking, an electric shock had run through my fingers. Not painful, but startling, as if the wood itself had been waiting for my touch. The sensation lingered for hours afterward, a tingling awareness that seemed to connect me to something vast and ancient. Working on the boat felt like remembering rather than learning. My hands knew where the boiler connections should sit, how the paddle wheel mechanism should align, which joints would bear the greatest stress. I found myself humming work songs I'd never heard, tapping out rhythms on the hull that matched some internal metronome I couldn't consciously access. But it was the sounds that truly unnerved me. Even with no boiler installed, no steam system connected, the Evangeline whispered constantly. Not the normal creaks and settling sounds of old wood. These were distinctly mechanical. The hiss of escaping steam, the distant clank of pistons, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of paddle wheels turning in empty air. I'd mentioned it to Dr. Holbrook, who'd attributed it to the building's old heating system and the natural expansion of aging timber. I knew better. The workshop held other restoration projects, but none of them sang like the Evangeline. At night, when I stayed late to work by lamplight, I could swear I heard voices drifting from her depths. Not words exactly, but the cadence of conversation, the rise and fall of human speech conducted in some language just beyond comprehension. More than once I'd called out, thinking another worker had stayed late, only to find myself completely alone with the boat and the shadows that seemed to cluster around her hull with unnatural density. My dreams began to change. Instead of standing at an unfamiliar helm, I found myself working in the Evangeline's engine room, my hands black with coal dust, my body moving with practiced efficiency through routines I'd never learned. The fog outside grew thicker each night, pressing against the portholes like seeking fingers. And always, somewhere in the distance, I could hear other boats, their whistles creating a mournful chorus that spoke of journeys never completed and harbors never reached. During the day, my work on the restoration progressed with disturbing speed. Components that should have taken weeks to fabricate seemed to assemble themselves under my hands. Period-appropriate materials appeared in the workshop without explanation. Dr. Holbrook mentioned grants and donations, but her eyes held a nervous uncertainty that suggested she was as mystified as I was by our sudden good fortune. The other museum staff began avoiding the restoration shed. Mary, who'd worked there for 15 years, mentioned that the area felt heavy now, oppressive in a way that made her chest tight and her thoughts scattered. Even Dr. Holbrook's visits became briefer and more perfunctory, her usual enthusiasm for historical detail replaced by a distracted urgency to complete the project and move the Evangeline to the exhibition hall. I should have been concerned by their reluctance. Instead, I felt protective of the boat, possessive in a way that made no rational sense. The Evangeline was becoming mine, or perhaps I was becoming hers. The distinction grew hazier with each passing day. My research into the boat's history yielded fragments and contradictions. Built in Baltimore for river trade, she'd supposedly sunk during a storm in 1851, though newspaper accounts of the incident were inconsistent. Some reports mentioned no survivors. Others suggested the entire crew had simply vanished, leaving the boat to drift empty until it finally ran aground. The passenger manifest from her final voyage had been lost, but local folklore spoke of strange disappearances along the river route, people who'd boarded for routine trips and were never seen again. I found myself drawn to old maps of the regional waterways, tracing routes with my finger along channels that had been silted in or diverted decades ago. One map, dating from 1849, showed a bend in the Patuxent River that matched perfectly with the impossible curve from my dreams. According to modern surveys, that section of river had been straightened in the 1920s, the old channel filled and abandoned. But in 1851, it had been navigable. The discovery should have provided closure, a rational explanation for my recurring nightmare. Instead, it opened new questions that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. How could I dream with such accuracy about a geographical feature that had been erased before my grandparents were born? How could I know the exact sound of paddle wheels churning through water I'd never seen? As the restoration neared completion, the phenomena intensified. Tools disappeared and reappeared in configurations I didn't remember creating. The boat's whistle, not yet installed, sounded at irregular intervals, echoing through the workshop with a mournful insistence that set my teeth on edge. I began staying later, arriving earlier, unable to bear the thought of leaving the Evangeline alone in the darkness. My sleep deteriorated. When I did manage to doze in the workshop's cramped office, my dreams expanded beyond the familiar crash sequence. I began experiencing entire voyages, loading cargo at dawn-lit docks, navigating treacherous currents, listening to passengers discuss business and family with the easy familiarity of routine travel. These dreams felt less like nightmares and more like memories, complete with physical sensations. The burn of coal smoke in my lungs, the vibration of the engine through the deck plates, the weight of responsibility that came with guiding souls through unpredictable waters. Dr. Holbrook announced that the Evangeline would make a demonstration voyage for the museum's board of directors. The restoration was complete enough for a short trip along the protected waters of the Chesapeake, nothing more than a publicity stunt to secure funding for the final exhibition preparations. She asked if I'd serve as pilot, acknowledging my unprecedented familiarity with the vessel's systems. I agreed, though something deep in my chest twisted with anticipation and dread. The night before the demonstration, I conducted a final inspection of the boat. Everything was perfect, more than perfect, if such a thing were possible. The brass gleamed with a warmth that seemed to emanate from within the metal itself. The wood showed no signs of its century of neglect, appearing instead as rich and new as the day it had first touched water. Even the restored paddle wheel turned with an oiled smoothness that defied its age. As I ran my hands along the helm, checking the wheel's response, I felt the familiar electric tingle, stronger now, almost urgent. The sensation spread up my arms and into my chest, a recognition that went deeper than muscle memory. This wheel had known my grip before. These waters had carried my wake. Standing alone on the deck, watching moonlight silver the quiet bay, I finally allowed myself to consider the impossible possibility that had been growing in my mind for weeks. The dreams weren't prophetic. They were retrospective. The knowledge wasn't intuitive. It was inherited, and the crash that had haunted my sleep for 26 years wasn't a vision of what might happen. It was a memory of what had already occurred. The whistle sounded again, long and low, though no steam pressure existed to power it. Around me, the Evangeline settled deeper into the water with a sigh that sounded almost like contentment. In the distance, barely audible over the lap of waves against the hull, I could hear the faint echo of other whistles answering, calling from waters that existed now only in the spaces between sleeping and waking. Tomorrow, we would take the Evangeline out onto the bay. The route Dr. Holbrook had planned would carry us past the mouth of the Patuxent River, near the location where maps showed that impossible bend had once carved its treacherous path through Maryland soil. If my growing suspicions proved correct, if the boundary between past and present was thinner than I'd ever imagined, then tomorrow I would finally understand what had been calling to me through decades of dreams. Whether I would survive that understanding remained to be seen. The whistle sounded a third time, and in its mournful voice, I heard something that might have been welcome or might have been warning. On the Evangeline, floating in waters that reflected a sky full of stars, I waited for dawn and wondered which of us, the boat or myself, was the ghost haunting the other's existence. The answer, I suspected, would reveal itself soon enough. Story 7. The contract stated 12 days. Simple rewiring job in an abandoned textile factory, 40 miles from the nearest town. The pay was too good to question. Triple my usual rate for what seemed like standard electrical work. I should have wondered why they needed someone willing to work alone in the middle of nowhere, why the previous contractor had simply vanished without collecting his final payment. The factory squatted against the October sky like a concrete tumor, its smokestacks reaching toward clouds that hung too low and too still. Broken windows stared down at me as I parked my van beside the loading dock, their jagged teeth catching what little sunlight managed to penetrate the perpetual gray that seemed to follow this place. The air tasted metallic, charged with something I couldn't name. Ozone, maybe, or the residue of decades-old industrial processes. My tools felt heavier than usual as I hauled them from the van. The analog watch on my wrist read 9:47 a.m., its second hand sweeping in perfect rhythm. I'd always preferred analog to digital. There was something comforting about the mechanical precision, the tiny gears working in harmony. I had three others in my toolkit: a stopwatch, a small desk clock I used for timing circuits, and a vintage pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather, all of them ticking in their steady, reassuring cadence. The factory door groaned open on hinges that hadn't seen oil in years. Inside, the air was thick and stagnant, filled with the smell of rust, dust, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that made my sinuses burn. Industrial fluorescence hung dark from the ceiling, and my flashlight beam carved a weak path through the gloom. The main hall stretched before me like the nave of some derelict cathedral. Massive looms sat shrouded in dust sheets, their skeletal frames creating a maze of shadows that shifted with my movement. The electrical panels were mounted along the far wall, their metal doors hanging open like hungry mouths. According to the blueprints, this was where I'd spend most of my time, ripping out the old copper wiring and replacing it with modern cables that could handle the load if they ever decided to resurrect this place. I was 3 steps into the hall when it hit me. The torpor came like a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders and skull. My legs felt suddenly heavy, as if I were walking through thick water. The flashlight wavered in my grip, its beam dancing across the floor in an unsteady pattern. I stopped, thinking maybe I was just tired from the long drive, or perhaps the stale air was getting to me. But as I stood there, trying to shake off the sudden lethargy, I noticed something that made my blood cool. Silence. Complete, absolute silence, where there should have been the familiar chorus of ticking. I looked down at my wrist. The watch face stared back at me, its hands frozen at 9:47 a.m. The second hand hung motionless between the 9 and 10, as if time itself had simply stopped. I pulled out my other timepieces. The stopwatch, dead. The desk clock, frozen. My grandfather's pocket watch hung open in my palm, its ornate hands locked in place like tiny golden statues. All of them had stopped at exactly the same moment, down to the second. My phone showed 10:23 a.m. 36 minutes. Gone. Just like that. I told myself it was a coincidence. Analog watches were sensitive to electromagnetic fields, and old factories were notorious for having electromagnetic anomalies. Maybe there was some residual charge in the building's metal framework, some quirk of the abandoned electrical system that was interfering with mechanical movements. It was a reasonable explanation. It was the explanation I clung to for the next 4 hours. The work progressed normally enough. I mapped the existing circuits, identified the junction boxes that would need replacement, and began the methodical process of stripping out the old wiring. The copper came away in long, tarnished coils that I piled near the entrance. Standard procedure, nothing unusual, except for the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, except for the way my skin prickled with the constant sensation of being watched, except for the way every analog timepiece I carried continued to malfunction the moment I entered the main hall. By afternoon, I'd developed a routine. I'd work for stretches in the side rooms and smaller spaces, where my watches functioned normally. Then I'd venture into the main hall for the heavy work, always setting my phone's timer before entering, always checking it obsessively to track the missing time. The pattern was consistent. Every time I crossed that threshold, every time I worked in the central space, hours would simply disappear. The first sigil appeared on the 3rd day. I'd been pulling cable from the main junction box, working my way across the hall in a systematic grid pattern. The work was going well. I was actually ahead of schedule. I stepped back to survey my progress and froze. The cables I'd removed lay arranged on the floor in a perfect geometric pattern, not randomly discarded where I'd dropped them, but carefully, deliberately arranged. Concentric circles of copper wire with smaller patterns radiating outward like the spokes of some arcane wheel. The precision was impossible. Every curve was symmetrical, every angle exact. It looked like a mandala made of metal, or perhaps some kind of electrical circuit diagram drawn by hands far steadier than mine. I had no memory of arranging it. Standing there in the dusty half-light, staring down at the impossible pattern, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. Maybe the electromagnetic anomalies in the building were affecting my brain as well as my watches. Maybe I was sleepwalking through parts of my workday, operating on some kind of autopilot while my conscious mind wandered. But the pattern was too perfect, too deliberate, too beautiful. I kicked it apart and continued working. The sigils grew more elaborate. Each day brought new configurations, more complex than the last. Cables braided into intricate knots that shouldn't have been possible with the gauge of wire I was using. Spirals that seemed to pulse and flow even when I knew they were static. Geometric forms that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained too many angles, as if my eyes couldn't quite process their true shape. And always, I had no memory of creating them. The lost time was getting worse. What had started as minutes was stretching into hours. I'd enter the main hall at 10 a.m. and emerge to find my phone showing 3 p.m., my analog watches still frozen, my progress measured not in the work I remembered doing, but in the impossible patterns I found waiting for me on the floor. I started leaving myself notes, simple messages scrawled on scraps of paper. Remember the junction box. Check the conduit on the south wall. Count the cables as you remove them. But when I found these notes again, they'd been altered. My handwriting, but different words. The pattern must be complete. The circuit requires organic conductor. Time moves differently in the spaces between. I didn't remember writing those things. By the 7th day, I was actively fighting the urge to flee. The contract specified completion within 12 days, with severe financial penalties for early termination. I needed this job, needed the money, needed the reference for future work. But more than that, I was beginning to suspect that leaving might not be as simple as walking away. The factory was different now. Subtly, impossibly different. Hallways that had been straight were now curved. Rooms I'd mapped carefully seemed to have shifted position. The main hall felt larger, its ceiling higher, its shadows deeper. And through it all, the sense of presence grew stronger. Not malevolent exactly, but hungry, patient, waiting for something. The breakthrough came on the 9th day, when I found the documentation. Hidden behind a loose panel in the foreman's office was a manila folder thick with yellowed papers. Work orders dating back 60 years. Incident reports. Safety violations. And buried among them, a series of technical documents that made my hands shake as I read them. Project synthesis. Electromagnetic life force transference. Biological battery research. The factory hadn't just manufactured textiles. In its final years, it had been the site of something else entirely. Experiments in using human bioelectrical fields to power machinery. Tests to determine whether consciousness itself could be harnessed as an energy source. The reports were clinical, detached, but the implications were horrifying. Dozens of workers had reported temporal displacement events. Equipment had operated without external power sources. And in the final months before the factory's closure, several employees had simply disappeared, not physically, but mentally. Their bodies continued to work, to follow routines, but their minds were elsewhere. Stored, perhaps, converted into another form of energy. The last entry in the folder was a single page, dated 3 days before the factory was officially shuttered. It was signed by someone identified only as Chief Engineer, and it consisted of a single paragraph. The primary harvesting array is now fully operational. Biological subjects entering the main collection chamber experience immediate temporal displacement, while their bioelectrical output is siphoned into the storage matrix. The process appears to be self-sustaining, requiring only occasional feeding to maintain optimal power levels. Recommend permanent installation of apparatus in the main hall flooring. The pattern must be completed. Below the text was a diagram, a perfect reproduction of the sigil I'd been unconsciously creating with the factory's cables. I understood then. The electromagnetic anomalies, the missing time, the impossible patterns, they weren't side effects of some long-dead industrial process. They were features. The factory was still operating, still harvesting, still feeding on the life force of anyone foolish enough to enter its main hall. And I'd been slowly wiring myself into its collection system, one cable at a time. But understanding brought a terrible new realization. As I sat in that dusty office, the folder trembling in my hands, I became aware of a fundamental wrongness in my perception. The shadows weren't just moving at the edges of my vision, they were moving through me. The feeling of being watched wasn't paranoia, it was recognition. Something was looking out through my eyes, thinking with my thoughts, moving my hands when my conscious mind was elsewhere. How long had it been since I'd made a decision that was truly my own? I checked my phone. 11:47 p.m. I had no memory of the day passing. The main hall called to me now with an urgency that felt like thirst, like hunger, like love. My tools needed to be arranged in their proper configuration. The final connections needed to be made. The pattern needed to be completed. I walked through the factory's corridors with steps that felt both familiar and foreign. My grandfather's pocket watch hung heavy in my hand, its frozen hands catching the beam of my flashlight. The main hall stretched before me, vast and welcoming, filled with shadows that moved in rhythm with my heartbeat. The cables were waiting. They formed a spiral now, perfect and complete, radiating outward from the center of the room in mathematical precision. Copper wire braided with patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. I could see how it all fit together, how each strand connected to the next in an endless loop of conduction and collection. All it needed was the final component. I knelt at the center of the sigil and placed my grandfather's watch carefully among the copper coils. The metal was warm against my fingers, warmer than it should have been. Around me, the factory hummed with barely audible electricity, circuits charging themselves, machinery preparing to wake from its long dormancy. The watch's hands began to move, not forward, backward. The second hand swept counterclockwise, faster and faster, unwinding the minutes and hours it had accumulated over decades of faithful service. As it moved, I felt something vital flowing out of me, drawn away by invisible currents that followed the copper pathways carved into the floor. My own time, flowing backward into the machine. I tried to stand, tried to break away from the pattern, but my body wouldn't obey. Or perhaps it was obeying, just not me. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, connecting the final cables, completing circuits that existed in dimensions I couldn't quite perceive. The sigil pulsed brighter, its electromagnetic field strengthening with each new connection. Through the factory's broken windows, I could see my van parked beside the loading dock. I could see myself arriving that first morning, tools in hand, ready to tackle a simple rewiring job. I could see myself leaving in 3 days' time, the contract completed, payment collected, another satisfied customer. I could see the next contractor arriving the following week. The temporal loop was perfect, self-sustaining, powered by the accumulated life force of everyone who entered its sphere of influence. We were all here, all of us who had come to fix the factory's electrical systems. We were the electrical system now, our consciousness converted into current, our memories transformed into the patterns that kept the machine running. Somewhere in the distance, I heard my phone ringing. The caller ID would show my wife's number, I knew. She'd be wondering why I hadn't called, why I was running late, when I'd be coming home. In a few hours, she'd call the police. In a few days, they'd find my van abandoned beside the loading dock, my tools scattered across the factory floor, no sign of where I'd gone. But I hadn't gone anywhere. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The watch's hands stopped moving, frozen once again at 9:47 a.m. Around me, the copper sigil hummed with satisfied electricity, fed and full and ready to wait for the next contractor, the next source of biological power to keep its ancient circuits alive. In 3 days, I would pack my tools and drive away, just as the contract specified. I would return home to my wife, collect my payment, and recommend the job to a colleague who needed the work. The factory would be properly rewired, its electrical systems upgraded and fully functional. And sometimes, late at night, I would find myself arranging copper wire into spirals on my workbench, my hands moving with mechanical precision, while my mind wandered through electromagnetic dreams of a place that existed somewhere between time and current, between flesh and circuitry, between the tick of an analog watch and the infinite moment between seconds. The pattern must be completed. It always is. Story 8. The first black cat appeared on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I buried my mother. I was closing up Esperanza, the restaurant I'd poured my soul into for the past 8 years, when I spotted it through the rain-streaked window. A sleek shadow perched on the brick ledge outside, yellow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The cat remained motionless as I locked the front door, its gaze following my every movement through the glass. What unsettled me wasn't the cat itself. Downtown had its share of strays, but the timing. That afternoon, I'd prepared mole poblano for the first time since Mom's funeral, following her handwritten recipe card with its coffee-stained margins and faded ink. The familiar dance of toasting chilies, grinding spices, and balancing chocolate with heat had felt like breathing underwater. Necessary, but suffocating. The cat vanished the moment I stepped outside. I told myself it was coincidence. Grief does strange things to perception, my therapist had warned me. The mind seeks patterns where none exist, especially when loss carves such deep hollows in daily routine. But as I walked to my car, the sensation of being watched clung to my shoulders like spider silk. The rain started the next time I attempted one of her recipes. It was Thursday evening, and I'd decided to tackle chiles rellenos, a dish that had defined my childhood weekends. Mom would spend hours charring poblanos over open flame, the kitchen thick with smoke and laughter. The memory felt sharp enough to draw blood as I selected the peppers, their skin waxy and familiar beneath my fingers. I was halfway through stuffing the chilies when the first drop struck the zinc roof above. The sound was gentle initially, a whispered percussion that grew steadily stronger. Through the kitchen skylight, I watched water streak the glass in lazy rivulets, while the late afternoon sun continued to slant through the front windows, a meteorological impossibility that should have alarmed me more than it did. Instead, I found myself mesmerized by the rhythm, the way it seemed to match my knife work as I diced onions with mechanical precision. The rain drummed against metal with increasing intensity, drowning out the typical sounds of downtown traffic. I might have been cooking in a cave at the bottom of the ocean, isolated from the rest of the world by sheets of falling water. That's when I noticed the reflection. The industrial stainless steel hood above my station acted like a warped mirror, showing distorted images of the kitchen below. But as I glanced up while seasoning the filling, I caught sight of another figure moving behind me, a shorter silhouette that stirred something at a burner I wasn't using. My hand froze halfway to the salt. When I spun around, the kitchen was empty, except for the gentle hiss of oil in my pan. I stood there for several heartbeats, studying every corner of the space I knew better than my own bedroom. Nothing moved except steam rising from my workstation, and shadows shifting as clouds passed overhead. Normal clouds, I realized, not the localized storm system that had been pounding my roof. The rain had stopped. Through the front windows, the street was bone dry. Sleep became elusive after that. I'd lie in my apartment above the restaurant listening for sounds from the kitchen below. The soft whoosh of gas igniting, the whisper of knife against cutting board, the subtle creak of cabinet doors opening. Each noise could be explained by old building settling or ambient street sounds, but explanation and comfort were different animals entirely. During the day, I found myself avoiding my mother's recipes with the same instinct that keeps fingers away from flame. Instead, I focused on the contemporary fusion dishes that had earned Esperanza its reputation. Customers complimented the innovation, the unexpected flavor profiles that set us apart from other restaurants in the district. They had no idea their chef was afraid of his own menu, but avoidance only works until it doesn't. The request came from a regular customer, Mrs. Chen, who'd been dining with us twice weekly since we opened. She'd heard through some mysterious neighborhood network that I occasionally prepared traditional Mexican dishes, family recipes passed down through generations. Could I possibly make pozole rojo for her anniversary dinner next week? Her late husband had raved about a similar dish from his travels to Guadalajara decades ago. The weight of expectation settled on my chest like a lead blanket. Mrs. Chen had never asked for anything special, had always been content with our regular offerings. How could I explain that certain recipes had become forbidden territory? that preparing them invited presences I couldn't understand or control. I heard myself agreeing before rational thought could intervene. The preparation began at dawn. I'd arrived early to give myself time, hoping daylight would offer protection from whatever had been manifesting in evening shadows. The dried chilies needed toasting first, guajillo and ancho primarily, with a touch of chipotle for depth. As I worked them in the dry pan, their earthy perfume filled the kitchen with memories so vivid, I could almost hear my mother's voice explaining the proper color of toasted skin. Not too dark, mijo. You want them to release their oils, not their bitterness. My hands moved with muscle memory older than conscious thought, guided by lessons absorbed through observation rather than instruction. This was how she'd taught me, not through formal recipes but through presence, through the shared language of heat and seasoning that requires no translation. The first black cat appeared as I began grinding the toasted chiles. It sat outside the service entrance, perfectly still except for the slow blink of golden eyes. Unlike the previous encounters, this one seemed patient, as if it had all the time in the world to watch me work. A second cat joined it moments later, then a third. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, silent sentinels that transformed my kitchen's back door into something resembling an altar. The rain began shortly after. This time, I was ready for it. I climbed onto the prep counter and pressed my face against the skylight, confirming what I already knew. Water fell only on this building, creating a precise boundary that defied meteorology. The neighboring structures remained dry under clear skies while my restaurant existed within its own private storm system. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt oddly comforted, as if the rain were a familiar embrace rather than an impossibility. The sound provided rhythm for my work as I built the complex layers of flavor that would define the pozole, pork shoulder braised until it fell apart, hominy kernels plump with absorbed broth, the deep red sauce that transformed simple ingredients into something approaching magic. The reflection appeared while I was adjusting seasoning. I'd been tasting the broth, adding salt and oregano in increments, when movement in the steel surface caught my peripheral vision. The figure was clearer this time, unmistakably feminine, shorter than my own 6-foot frame, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in the style my mother had favored during her later years. She moved with purpose, stirring something in a pot that didn't exist in my reality. Her motions were familiar, the particular way she'd held a spoon, the gentle circular pattern she'd used to incorporate spices without creating turbulence. I recognized the slight forward lean of her shoulders, the unconscious swaying that had always accompanied her cooking. "Mom?" The word escaped before I could stop it. The reflection paused, the figure's head turning slightly as if acknowledging my presence. For one impossible moment, our eyes met through the warped surface of stainless steel, hers dark and knowing, filled with an urgency I couldn't interpret. Then she raised one translucent finger and pointed toward the stove. I followed her gesture to find my pozole beginning to scorch. In my fascination with the reflection, I'd forgotten to stir. I lurched forward, frantically mixing the contents, but it was too late. The bottom layer had caramelized beyond redemption, leaving a bitter undertone that no amount of correction could mask. When I looked back at the steel surface, it showed only my own face, drawn and pale, eyes wide with something between fear and longing. Mrs. Chen accepted my apology with the grace of someone who'd weathered far worse disappointments than ruined anniversary dinners. I offered to prepare something else, anything from our regular menu, but she declined with gentle firmness. Perhaps another time, she suggested, when I felt more confident with family recipes. The kindness in her tone cut deeper than anger would have. That night, I sat in the dining room after closing, surrounded by empty tables and my own failure. The cats had dispersed when the rain stopped, leaving no trace of their vigil except the persistent sense that I'd missed something crucial. The reflection hadn't reappeared since the pozole disaster, but I could feel potential presence hovering at the edges of perception, like heat shimmer on summer pavement. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos from my mother's last months, when cancer had stolen her appetite, but not her passion for feeding others. In one image, she stood in this very kitchen during a surprise visit, hands gesturing as she explained some technique I'd been struggling with. Her expression carried the patient intensity of someone passing down not just recipes but entire worlds of knowledge. "What are you trying to tell me?" I wondered, staring at her captured smile. The answer came, not in words but in sudden understanding, a clarity so sharp it left me breathless. She wasn't haunting the kitchen. She was completing it. Every reflection, every impossible storm, every watchful cat had been attempts at correction, guidance offered from whatever realm she now inhabited. The pozole had failed not because of supernatural interference but because I'd forgotten her most important lesson. Cooking with heart requires complete presence. I'd been so focused on the phenomenon of her appearance that I'd neglected the food itself, the sacred act of transformation that had always been our shared language. I began again the next morning. This time I embraced the ritual completely. I lit a candle at the prep station, something she'd done during important meals, and spoke to the empty kitchen as I worked, describing each step as if she were learning beside me, rather than teaching from beyond. The cats returned, but I welcomed them as witnesses rather than omens. The rain drummed its familiar rhythm, and I let it guide my movements instead of questioning its impossibility. The reflection appeared as I built the sauce, but now I understood what I was seeing. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, but memory made manifest through love and longing. She moved in perfect synchronization with my actions, her ghostly hands mirroring mine as we prepared the dish together across the boundary between worlds. When she pointed this time, it was toward the oregano, a gentle reminder that I'd been heavy-handed with the herb during my previous attempt. I adjusted accordingly, tasting as I went, building layers of flavor with the patience she'd tried to teach me for decades. The pozole emerged perfect, rich and complex, with heat that warmed rather than burned. I ladled a portion into a bowl and set it at the altar-like arrangement outside, where the cats waited with supernatural patience. They approached cautiously, sniffing the offering before settling into a loose circle around the bowl. As they ate, the rain gradually diminished to a whisper, then stopped entirely. The reflection faded from the stainless steel surfaces until only my own image remained. But for the first time since her death, I didn't feel alone in the kitchen. Mrs. Chen returned the following week, though she didn't request pozole. Instead, she ordered our signature duck confit with mole reduction, a fusion dish that had never appeared on my mother's table but somehow carried her influence in every spoonful. As I plated the dish, I caught a brief glimpse of approval in the steel hood's surface, a subtle nod that warmed me more than any five-star review. The cats still appear when I prepare her recipes, though less frequently now. The rain continues to fall only on my building during those sacred cooking sessions, creating a pocket of impossible weather that I've learned to cherish rather than question. The reflections come and go, offering guidance when I need it most, corrections when my technique strays from her teachings. I've stopped trying to understand the mechanics of what happens in my kitchen. Some phenomena exist beyond the reach of rational explanation, rooted in forces deeper than science can measure. Love, loss, the unbreakable bonds between teacher and student. These create their own physics, their own natural laws. But sometimes, late at night when the restaurant is empty and shadows gather in familiar corners, I wonder if I'm the one being guided or if I've become something else entirely. The line between chef and medium has blurred beyond recognition, and I'm no longer certain where my intentions end and her influence begins. When I cook her recipes now, whose hands are truly doing the work? Whose memories guide the seasoning? Whose instincts determine when the sauce has reached perfect consistency? The uncertainty should terrify me. Instead, it feels like coming home. Last week, I found a new recipe card tucked between the pages of her old notebook, written in her careful script, but describing a dish I'd never seen her prepare. The ingredients are familiar, the technique clearly her own, but the combination is something entirely new. It sits on my prep counter now, waiting for the right moment, the right configuration of cats and rain and reflected presence. I think I understand now what she's been trying to teach me. The recipes were never just about food, they were about transformation, about the alchemy that occurs when love infuses every ingredient. She's not perfecting her legacy, she's helping me create my own. Tonight, when the last customer leaves and the dining room falls silent, I'll light a candle and attempt her new creation. The cats will gather, the rain will fall, and in the distorted surface of stainless steel, I'll see what happens when the boundary between worlds becomes as permeable as the membrane between chef and dish, between tradition and innovation, between the living and the dead. I'm no longer certain which side of that boundary I belong to, and perhaps that's exactly where I'm meant to be. Story 9. The digital radio crackled to life without warning. Marcus and I had been driving in comfortable silence up the winding mountain road when the dashboard display suddenly illuminated, frequencies scrolling by themselves until settling on static that gradually resolved into something that made my skin crawl. Low, resonant voices began chanting in Latin, their harmonies echoing through the car speakers with an otherworldly precision that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. "Did you touch that?" I asked, glancing at my brother as he navigated another hairpin turn. Marcus shook his head, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. We both knew he hadn't touched anything. The radio had been off since we'd left the valley floor an hour ago, and now it broadcast this haunting chorus, as if summoned by our proximity to something we couldn't yet see. The real estate listing had been too good to pass up. A recently renovated alpine chalet, priced well below market value, with panoramic mountain views and immediate availability. Our property investment business had thrived on exactly these kinds of opportunities. Distressed sales, motivated sellers, properties with minor flaws that could be quickly flipped for substantial profit. But as the Latin chanting continued, growing somehow more insistent with each verse, I found myself questioning why anyone would sell such a property at such a price. The GPS showed we were approaching the Blackwater Gorge, though the audio tour we downloaded made no mention of it. I pulled out my phone to cross-reference our location, but the screen showed only a blank map with our blue dot floating in white space, as if the satellite couldn't penetrate whatever lay ahead. "There," Marcus said, pointing through the windshield. The chalet emerged from behind a stand of dark pines like something from a fever dream. 3 stories of weathered timber and stone, it perched on a rocky outcrop that jutted over the gorge like an accusatory finger. Smoke rose from its chimney in a perfectly straight column, despite the mountain wind that had been buffeting our car for the past 20 minutes. The structure looked solid, well-maintained, even beautiful in its alpine isolation, yet something about it made my vision blur at the edges, as if my eyes refused to focus properly on its details. The radio fell silent the moment Marcus turned off the engine. We sat in the sudden quiet, the absence of sound more unsettling than the chanting had been. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. My ears rang with phantom echoes of those Latin voices, and I found myself holding my breath without knowing why. "Beautiful place," Marcus said, but his voice carried a forced brightness that suggested he felt the same unease creeping through his chest. We'd done this dance dozens of times, walking properties, assessing value, calculating renovation costs and profit margins. This should have been routine. Instead, it felt like approaching a tomb. The real estate agent had provided us with a lockbox code, explaining she couldn't make the drive herself due to other commitments. Standard practice for properties this remote, she'd assured us, though now I wondered what those commitments really were. As we approached the heavy wooden door, our footsteps echoed strangely on the stone path, each sound seeming to bounce back from directions that made no geometric sense. The key turned easily, and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges. The interior struck me immediately with its wrongness. Not anything I could pinpoint. The furniture looked expensive. The hardwood floors gleamed with recent care, and afternoon sunlight streamed through large windows that should have been welcoming. But the temperature felt off. Despite the smoke we'd seen rising from the chimney, despite the fire that crackled visibly in the stone hearth, the air held a bone-deep chill that made me zip my jacket higher. "Must be poor insulation," Marcus murmured, though I noticed he kept his hands in his pockets as we moved through the main room. I approached the fireplace, drawn by the promise of warmth that never materialized. The flames danced convincingly behind the grate, consuming what appeared to be real logs, yet I felt no heat even when I held my palms inches from the fire. My breath began to mist in the air, and I watched with growing unease as the vapor didn't dissipate normally. Instead, it seemed to hang in the air, forming shapes that looked almost like symbols before finally fading. "Mark, look at this." I turned to find Marcus standing at one of the large windows, his breath fogging the glass in rapid puffs. But instead of random condensation, the moisture formed patterns, the same symbols I'd seen in my own breath, angular marks that resembled runes or ancient script, appearing and fading in perfect rhythm with our exhalations. "Air pressure differential," I said automatically, though the explanation felt hollow even as I spoke it. "Old windows, improper ceiling." Marcus nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We'd evaluated enough properties to know when something deviated from normal, and this chalet was accumulating deviations like storm clouds. I pulled out my phone to document the window issue for our assessment notes, but the camera displayed only a black screen. I tapped the app, restarted it, even tried the video function, but nothing worked. Marcus had similar trouble with his device. Cameras that had functioned perfectly during our drive now refused to capture anything. "Interference from the elevation, maybe," he suggested, though we both knew we'd photographed properties at similar altitudes without issue. I tried one more time, holding my phone up to capture the main room's layout. The screen remained black for several seconds, then flickered once and displayed an image that made my blood freeze. Instead of the empty room I was photographing, the picture showed the same space filled with dark, hooded figures standing in perfect formation around the fireplace. They faced the camera with shadowed faces I couldn't make out, their posture suggesting they'd been waiting there for some time. I blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by the normal camera interface showing the empty room exactly as my eyes saw it. "Did you see?" I began. "The figures," Marcus finished. "I saw them too." We stared at each other across the room, the weight of shared hallucination or shared reality settling between us like a third presence. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, to chalk it up to altitude sickness or equipment malfunction, and report back to our office that the property wasn't viable. But 20 years in real estate had taught us to look past surface problems, and the potential profit on this deal would set us up for the next 2 years. I forced myself to continue the walkthrough, noting the quality of the kitchen appliances, the condition of the bathroom fixtures, the structural soundness of the staircase leading to the upper floors. Marcus followed, and we fell into our familiar routine of assessment and documentation, though neither of us attempted to use our cameras again. The second floor held 3 bedrooms, each one maintaining that same impossible chill despite the continued presence of heating vents and the sound of the furnace running somewhere below. In the master bedroom, I noticed that the windows showed the same symbol-forming condensation, and when I spoke aloud to test the acoustics, my voice seemed to echo back with additional harmonics I hadn't produced. "The seller really wants to move this property," Marcus said as we climbed to the 3rd floor, which housed a single large room under the peaked roof. "Price reduction twice in the last month according to the listing history." "Motivated seller's good for us," I replied, though I was beginning to understand why the price kept dropping. The 3rd floor room appeared to serve as a combination library and study, with built-in bookshelves lining 3 walls and a large desk positioned near the single dormer window. But it was the 4th wall that captured my attention, where I expected more shelves or perhaps artwork. Instead, I found what looked like architectural plans mounted in frames, dozens of them showing detailed layouts of the chalet from every possible angle. I approached for a closer look and felt my stomach clench. The plans weren't for renovation or expansion. They were detailed maps of sound propagation, showing how voices would carry throughout the structure, how harmonies would resonate in specific rooms, how a group of singers positioned strategically throughout the building could create perfect acoustic alignment. "Marcus," I called, but when I turned around, he wasn't there. His footsteps echoed from somewhere below, moving through the house with purpose, though I hadn't heard him leave the room. I called again, louder this time, and received only my own voice bouncing back with those strange additional harmonics that seemed to form words in a language I didn't recognize. I descended quickly, finding Marcus in the main room, standing exactly where those hooded figures had appeared in my camera's image. He faced the fireplace with an expression of vacant concentration, and when he spoke, his voice carried an odd resonance. "We should make an offer," he said without turning around. "Full asking price. Today." "Marcus, we haven't finished the assessment. We haven't checked the foundation, the electrical, the acoustics are perfect," he interrupted. And now he did turn to face me. His eyes held an intensity I'd never seen before, a focus that seemed directed at something just beyond my left shoulder. "Can't you hear it? The house is designed for voices, for a choir." The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and our breath now formed visible clouds with every word. But Marcus didn't seem to notice the cold. He pulled out his phone, the same device that had refused to work moments earlier, and began typing rapidly. "I'm sending the offer now. The seller will accept. They always accept." "Always?" I asked. "Marcus, this is the first time we've seen this property." He looked at me with confusion that seemed genuine, as if I'd said something incomprehensible. "We've been here before. We come here every time. Don't you remember the songs?" Outside, the wind returned with sudden violence, rattling the windows and sending debris against the glass with sharp, irregular percussion. But beneath that natural sound, I began to detect something else. Distant voices carrying on the air, growing slowly closer. The same Latin chanting we'd heard on the radio, but now it seemed to surround the house, rising from the gorge below and descending from the peaks above. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his familiar features into something I barely recognized. "They're welcoming us back." I grabbed his arm, feeling how unnaturally cold his skin had become even through his jacket. "We're leaving. Now." But as I pulled him toward the door, I realized the chanting wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from within the house itself, from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air around us. Voices that seemed to emerge from every surface, building in harmony and volume, until the sound became a physical presence that pressed against my eardrums and made my vision swim. Marcus pulled free of my grip with surprising strength. "You can't leave," he said, and his voice now perfectly matched the pitch and rhythm of the invisible choir. "Not until you've added your voice to ours." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling between rational explanations and the evidence of my senses. Carbon monoxide poisoning could cause hallucinations. Altitude sickness could affect judgment. Old houses could have acoustic anomalies that created unsettling sound effects. But none of those explanations accounted for the way Marcus moved now, with fluid grace that didn't match his usual careful gait, or how his breath no longer formed visible vapor despite the Arctic temperature that had me shivering violently. The front door stood open. When had that happened? But beyond the threshold lay not the mountain path we'd climbed, but an endless corridor filled with the same hooded figures I'd seen in my camera. They stood in perfect rows, their faces still hidden in shadow, their mouths moving in silent formation that somehow produced the overwhelming chorus filling the house. I spun around, seeking another exit, but found myself facing Marcus, and an identical figure standing beside him, myself, wearing the same vacant smile, the same two bright eyes. This other version of me opened its mouth and added a new harmonic line to the ongoing chant, a deep baritone that I recognized as my own voice despite never having produced those sounds. "The property evaluation is complete," Marcus said, holding up his phone to show a submitted offer form. "Purchase price accepted, closing scheduled for tomorrow." "We can't close tomorrow," I protested. "There are inspections, financing, legal reviews." "The house provides everything we need," the other me said. And I felt my own mouth beginning to move in the same rhythm, my vocal cords vibrating with sounds I didn't intend to make. "The house has always provided everything we need." The Latin words began forming on my lips without conscious thought, as if I'd known them my entire life and was simply remembering rather than learning. Around me, the hooded figures materialized more clearly, and I could see they wore business suits beneath their hoods, real estate investors like us, who had come to assess the property and remain to become part of its eternal choir. Some part of my mind that still functioned rationally understood that I was experiencing some form of breakdown. Stress-induced psychosis, perhaps, or exposure to environmental toxins. The smart thing would be to seek medical attention, to report the gas leak or mold contamination that was clearly affecting my brain chemistry. But that rational voice grew fainter with each passing moment, overwhelmed by the perfect harmonies filling my consciousness and the warm sense of belonging that spread through my chest as my voice joined the eternal song. Marcus handed me a pen and a contract I didn't remember seeing before. "Just sign here," he said, "and here, and here." I looked down at the paperwork, but the words seemed to shift and blur, rearranging themselves into the same symbols that had appeared in our breath on the windows. My signature flowed onto the pages with handwriting I didn't recognize, though the pen felt familiar in my grip. "Welcome home," said a voice that might have been Marcus, or myself, or the house itself speaking through us all. Outside, another car approached on the mountain road, its radio crackling to life as it entered the reception range of our perpetual broadcast. Through the window, I watched two new figures climb toward the front door, investors undoubtedly, drawn by the promising listing and competitive price. I moved to take my position among the welcoming committee, my voice now perfectly synchronized with the eternal chorus, ready to help guide these new arrivals through their property evaluation. After all, the acoustics really were perfect, and motivated sellers always made the best deals. The only question that remained, echoing faintly in whatever corner of my consciousness still resisted the harmonious logic of this place, was whether I had ever really been anyone other than a voice in this choir, or if Marcus and I had simply been the latest additions to a song that had been playing in these mountains far longer than any property records could document. But that question, like all the others that had brought us here, dissolved into irrelevance as the new investors crossed the threshold, and the ancient song welcomed them home. Story 10. The hiss was always there first, not the clean, predictable static of properly functioning equipment, but something organic, breathing through the console's guts like a living thing settling into warm circuitry. I'd been mixing at Vintage Valley Studios for 3 weeks when I first noticed how the background noise seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, especially during those dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m., when the city's electromagnetic interference dropped to nearly nothing. The studio had been shuttered since 1987, gathering dust and reputation like some audio archaeology project. When the new owners hired me to restore the vintage Neve 8068 console and bring the old analog charm back to life, I figured it would be straightforward work. Clean the faders, replace the worn potentiometers, calibrate the VU meters. Standard restoration mixed with the kind of night shifts that paid well enough to ignore the building's reputation for eating sound engineers. But analog equipment holds memory differently than digital. Every capacitor, every length of wire, every magnetic head carries traces of what passed through it before. The studio's history lived in its circuits like scar tissue. The first night I heard my name, I was isolating the bass frequencies on a jazz quartet session from earlier that week. Simple EQ work, nothing fancy. Just carving out muddy low end to make room for the upright bass to breathe. I had the monitors cranked loud enough to feel the sub-bass in my chest, riding the faders with muscle memory while my eyes tracked the dancing needles of the VU meters. That's when it happened. A voice low and gravelly, speaking my name through the isolation booth monitors. "Marcus." I yanked my headphones off, heart hammering against my ribs. The studio fell silent except for the console's gentle electrical hum. I stared at the isolation booth through the control room glass, its red on AR light dark, the space empty as a held breath. Probably just acoustic bleed from the hallway, maybe a security guard doing rounds. I convinced myself of this, even as I checked the building's floor plan again, confirming that the isolation booth's speakers weren't connected to the building's intercom system. Even as I replayed the last 30 seconds of audio and found nothing but clean bass frequencies, no trace of human voice. I should have left then. Should have packed up my gear and found daytime work mixing wedding videos or podcast interviews. But there's something about the hunt that gets into your blood when you're an audio engineer. That need to track down every unwanted noise, to identify and eliminate every imperfection until you've achieved something approaching sonic truth. The second night, I brought a digital recorder. I set it up in the isolation booth, let it run while I worked. The studio felt different after midnight. The air thicker, the shadows deeper between the baffles and equipment racks. The vintage gear seemed to radiate warmth like sleeping animals, tubes glowing amber in the dim light. Around 2:30 a.m., while cleaning up dialogue tracks for a voiceover session, I heard it again. Clearer this time, more distinct. Marcus, can you hear me?" The voice was coming through the console itself, bleeding through channels I'd muted. I traced the signal path frantically, checking input levels, monitoring the patch bay for loose connections. Nothing. But when I played back the digital recorder, it had captured only silence and the ambient hum of the room. That's when I found the tape. It was buried in a storage cabinet behind a wall of quarter-inch masters from the late 60s, stuffed between session reels for bands I'd never heard of. The reel was smaller than the others, maybe 20 minutes of tape, with a handwritten label in faded blue ink. Lost take, final session, 1968. The moment I threaded it onto the Ampex 440 playback machine, the studio changed. The air grew denser, charged with the kind of pressure that builds before thunderstorms. Even with all the lights on, shadows seemed to cluster in the corners like they were being drawn there by some unseen force. I pressed play. Static filled the monitors, not the clean hiss of blank tape, but something corrupted, layered with harmonics that shouldn't exist in analog recordings. Underneath the noise, barely audible, I could make out the faint suggestion of a melody, a voice singing something I couldn't quite identify, the words lost in the magnetic fog of 4 decades. Then the VU meters locked. Both needles snapped to the same position, not quite in the red, but close enough to make my palms sweat. They held there, perfectly still, even as I adjusted the playback level, even as I muted the channel entirely. The meters stayed frozen like they were measuring something beyond the audio signal, something the machine could sense but couldn't properly quantify. That's when I noticed the clock. The digital display on the console had started counting backward. Not quickly, just 1 second at a time, but unmistakably reversing. 23:47, 12, 23:47, 11, 23:47, 10. I watched it fall for exactly 67 seconds before it snapped back to the correct time, the VU meters finally releasing their death grip on whatever they'd been measuring. I stopped the tape, my hands shaking enough that I nearly dropped the reel. The studio felt normal again, or as normal as a 60-year-old recording facility could feel at 3 in the morning. But something had shifted. The balance of the room was different, like furniture had been moved while my back was turned. Over the following nights, I became obsessed with that tape. I told myself I was conducting legitimate research, analyzing the recording with scientific rigor. I ran spectrum analysis on the audio, looking for hidden frequencies or embedded signals. I experimented with different playback speeds, different EQ settings, different monitor configurations. Each time I played it, the same thing happened. The VU meters would freeze, the clock would run backward for 67 seconds, and the voice in the static would grow slightly clearer. Not clearer in terms of volume or frequency response, but clearer in intention, as if it was learning to communicate through the medium of magnetic tape. By the second week, I could make out individual words. Found you. Waiting. Come back. By the third week, I started hearing the voice even when the tape wasn't playing. It would whisper my name through the console speakers during quiet moments between songs. It would bleed through the isolation booth monitors while I was tracking new sessions during the day, a low murmur underneath the legitimate audio that other people couldn't seem to hear. When I asked the vocalist if he'd heard anything unusual during his session, he just looked at me with the kind of polite concern reserved for people who might be losing their grip. I started staying later, arriving earlier. The studio became my entire world, a self-contained universe of knobs and faders and glowing tubes. I brought a sleeping bag and set up a makeshift bed behind the mixing console. Why go home when all the answers were here, hidden in the circuits and magnetic fields of vintage equipment that had been recording human voices for longer than I'd been alive? The tape was teaching me things, not through words, but through the experience of playing it back. through the patterns that emerged in the VU meter positions and the specific way the clock counted backward. I began to understand that the 67 seconds weren't random. They were significant, a timestamp of sorts, a specific moment in 1968 that the recording was trying to return to. I researched the studio's history, diving deep into local newspaper archives and music industry publications. Vintage Valley had been called West Side Sound in the 60s, a small operation that specialized in recording local bands and singer-songwriters. In November 1968, they'd been working with a vocalist named David Chen, laying down tracks for what was supposed to be his debut album. He'd disappeared during the final session. Not dramatically, no signs of struggle, no ransom notes. He'd simply stepped into the isolation booth for a final vocal take and never came out. The police report was frustratingly vague. The control room engineer had been setting levels, looked up to cue the singer, and found the booth empty. The building was searched thoroughly. David Chen was never seen again. The session had been scheduled to run from 11:00 p.m. to 3:00 a.m. According to the police report, Chen had disappeared sometime around 11:47 p.m., 67 minutes into the session. I started timing the clock's backward run more carefully. It always stopped at 23:47, 43, 11:47, and 43 seconds p.m. The exact moment I realized that David Chen had vanished from the isolation booth. The revelation should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just restoring vintage equipment. I was solving a mystery that had been encoded in magnetic tape for over 50 years. The studio wasn't haunted in any traditional sense. It was incomplete, missing a crucial piece of audio that had been torn away at the moment of David Chen's disappearance. I began experimenting with the isolation booth itself, setting up microphones and recording my own voice while the mysterious tape played in the background. The results were immediately unsettling. My voice would develop strange harmonics, doubling effects that weren't coming from any processing equipment. Sometimes, listening back to these recordings, I could swear I heard two voices singing in unison, mine and something else, something that resonated at frequencies human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. The night everything changed started like any other. I'd been working on a mix for a local indie band, typical 4-piece arrangement with guitar, bass, drums, and vocals. Nothing experimental, nothing that should have caused problems. But as I isolated the lead vocal track, I heard it again. My name, spoken clearly through the monitors. This time, I was ready. I had every channel monitored, every input mapped, every possible signal path documented. The voice wasn't coming through the microphones. It wasn't bleeding from adjacent tracks. It was emerging from the console itself, generated somewhere in the analog circuitry like the equipment was learning to speak. I queued up the 1968 tape and pressed play, watching the VU meters snap to their familiar positions as the clock began its backward journey. But instead of the usual static and buried melody, I heard something new. The voice was clearer now, almost conversational in tone. "Marcus," it said, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. The monitors, the headphones, the very air in the control room. I've been waiting for someone who could hear me properly, someone who understands how sound works, how it can be preserved and shaped. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to shut down the equipment and leave the building. But the engineer in me was fascinated by the technical impossibility of what I was hearing. How was the voice maintaining such consistent levels across different monitoring systems? How was it generating fundamental frequencies below the range of the studio's speakers? "You've been listening," the voice continued, and I realized it was responding to my thoughts as much as my presence. "You've been trying to understand what happened to me. The answer is simpler than you think." The isolation booth's red light flickered on, though I hadn't activated it. Through the control room glass, I could see the space filling with something that wasn't quite shadow and wasn't quite light. A presence that bent the air around it like heat shimmer. "I never left," David Chen's voice explained, and now I could hear it clearly through the booth monitors, as well as the console speakers. "I just got stuck between the playback and the recording, caught in the magnetic field like an echo that can't find its way out." The VU meters were dancing now, showing activity that corresponded to nothing in the actual audio signal. The clock had stopped its backward countdown and was now displaying a series of numbers that looked more like coordinates than time. 67, 47, 43, 67, 47, 44, 67, 47, 45. But you understand, don't you, Marcus? You know how sound works. How voices can be captured and shaped and given new life through the right equipment. I found my own voice, though it sounded strange in the charged air of the control room. What do you want? To finish the session, came the reply, and the presence in the isolation booth grew more distinct. I could almost see a figure now, tall and lean, standing at the vintage microphone I'd restored just weeks earlier. To record the take that got interrupted, but I need something from you first. What? Your voice, Marcus, just temporarily. A few minutes of your vocal cords so I can remember how to make sound in the physical world. You can have them back when we're done. The request sounded reasonable, even logical. I was an engineer, after all. I understood about signal flow and temporary routing. It would be like patching my voice through his effects chain, letting him use my hardware to run his software. A simple technical procedure. I started toward the isolation booth, my hand reaching for the door handle, when some deeper survival instinct finally kicked in. I stopped, paralyzed by the sudden understanding of what I was about to do. The voice in the booth wasn't asking to borrow my vocal cords. It was asking to replace them. To overwrite my voice with its own, the way magnetic tape could be recorded over, erasing what came before. I see you understand, David Chen said, and there was sadness in the static-laden tone. You're smarter than the others. They never figured out what I was offering them. Others? 3 engineers before you, Marcus. Each one heard me calling. Each one tried to solve the mystery. But they all made the same mistake in the end. The studio felt different now, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the vintage equipment. I could sense other presences in the room. Not visible, but definitely there. Other voices waiting in the magnetic fields of the tape machines, the tube preamps, the analog circuitry that had been their final recording medium. Where are they now? Where do you think? Same place I am. Same place you'll be when you realize that finishing the session is the only way to make the voices stop. I looked at the console, at the VU meters still frozen on their impossible readings, at the clock displaying coordinates to somewhere that existed outside normal time. I thought about the weeks I'd spent obsessing over this mystery, the way the studio had gradually consumed my life until I'd forgotten what existed beyond its walls. The tape isn't trying to communicate with me, I said slowly, the realization dawning like a sunrise in reverse. It's trying to convert me. Finally, David Chen's voice replied, and now I could hear the others joining in. A chorus of engineers and musicians who'd gotten too close to understanding how vintage equipment could hold more than just audio signals. Now you're ready to make the best recording of your life. The isolation booth door swung open on its own, revealing the vintage microphone bathed in warm amber light. The presence that had been David Chen beckoned me forward. No longer bothering to maintain the illusion of humanity, it was pure sonic energy now, a waveform looking for a medium to inhabit. I took a step toward the booth, then another. The logical part of my mind screamed protests, but the engineer in me was curious about the technical aspects of the transformation. How exactly did consciousness transfer through magnetic recording? What kind of frequency response would my voice have once it was integrated into the studio's analog memory? My hand touched the doorframe of the isolation booth. The red on-air light blazed to life, and somewhere in the building's electrical system, I heard the sound of VU meters clicking to attention, ready to measure whatever I was about to become. Story 11. The brass key felt heavier than it should have in my palm, its weight seeming to increase with each step I took toward the greenhouse's ornate entrance. Dr. Margaret Hensley had handed it to me 3 days earlier, with an expression that lingered somewhere between relief and concern, explaining that the revitalization project required after-hours access due to the delicate nature of the botanical collection. What she hadn't mentioned was the way the building seemed to exhale when approached in darkness, or how the condensation on its Victorian glass panels formed patterns that resembled nervous system diagrams. The Meridian Botanical Garden's crown jewel stood before me like a crystal cathedral, its iron framework casting intricate shadows under the amber security lights. Built in 1892 by the obsessive botanist Dr. Edmund Thorne, the greenhouse had been his life's work, a perfectly controlled ecosystem where he had spent 43 years creating hybrid species that existed nowhere else on Earth. His sudden disappearance in 1935 had left behind only detailed journals filled with increasingly erratic handwriting and botanical sketches that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. I pressed the key into the lock, and the mechanism turned with surprising ease, as if the building wanted me inside. The heavy door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo longer than acoustics should allow. The humid air rushed out to meet me, carrying with it the dense fragrance of tropical blooms and something else, something organic and primordial that made my throat tighten instinctively. Inside, emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The main conservatory stretched before me like a jungle cathedral, with Dr. Thorne's original plantings creating a labyrinth of green corridors beneath the soaring glass dome. Palm fronds rustled despite the absence of any breeze, and somewhere in the depths of the vegetation, I could hear the steady drip, drip, drip of the irrigation system mixing with sounds I couldn't immediately identify. My first task was to assess the symbolic vine that dominated the eastern wall, Dr. Thorne's pride and joy, according to the historical records. The specimen had grown wild over the decades, its massive stems twisted around the greenhouse's support beams like arthritic fingers. Its leaves were unnaturally large and waxy, with veination patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of human circulatory systems. The thing had to be carefully removed to allow for the installation of new climate control equipment. But every preservation attempt by previous contractors had failed for reasons that remained mysteriously vague in the project files. I approached the vine with my pruning shears, studying its attachment points to determine the best strategy for removal. The plant seemed healthy enough, its leaves glossy and firm, though there was something about its posture that suggested awareness rather than mere phototropism. As I reached out to touch one of the larger leaves, the greenhouse fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was more startling than any loud noise could have been. The dripping stopped, the rustling ceased, and even the hum of the ventilation system faded to nothing. In that vacuum of silence, I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat, thundering so loudly it seemed to echo off the glass walls. Then they began to growl. It started as a low rumble that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the soles of my work boots and up into my chest. The sound seemed to emerge from everywhere at once, from the soil beneath my feet, from the towering palms overhead, from the very air itself. It was a sound no plant should make, yet unmistakably organic, like the warning growl of a massive predator awakening from sleep. I stumbled backward, my shears clattering to the floor, and the growling intensified. The vine I had been examining began to move, not the slow, imperceptible growth of normal vegetation, but a deliberate writhing motion that sent its leaves rustling with urgent whispers. Other plants throughout the greenhouse joined the cacophony, their stems swaying in perfect unison despite the complete absence of wind. The glass walls began to fog from the inside, condensation forming in spiraling patterns that defied the laws of physics. As I watched in fascination and growing terror, the water droplets arranged themselves into intricate shapes, botanical diagrams drawn with scientific precision, complete with detailed annotations and spidery cursive handwriting. The script was too small to read from where I stood, but something about its formation made my skin crawl with the certainty that I was witnessing something that should not exist. I forced myself to move closer to one of the fogged panels, squinting at the condensation patterns. The writing was definitely in English, though the style belonged to another era. What I could make out seemed to be notes about hybridization techniques, but the terminology was unlike anything in modern botanical science. Words like neural grafting and consciousness transfer appeared alongside detailed diagrams of root systems that looked disturbingly similar to brain tissue. Behind me, the growling had evolved into something more complex, a layered harmony of organic sounds that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere animal communication. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see, and discovered that the entire greenhouse had changed during the brief moments I had spent examining the glass. The vegetation had rearranged itself. Plants that had been scattered throughout the conservatory now formed distinct clusters, creating clear pathways that led deeper into the structure. The symbolic vine had extended new tendrils across the ceiling, forming an intricate web that pulsed with a rhythm uncomfortably similar to a heartbeat. Most disturbing of all, the soil in several planters had begun to churn and bubble, as if something large was moving beneath the surface. I grabbed my shears and backed toward the entrance, but the door had somehow swung shut without my noticing. The brass handle refused to turn, and when I pressed my shoulder against the heavy wood, it didn't budge. The growling around me intensified, taking on what I could only describe as an amused quality, as if the greenhouse itself was enjoying my predicament. That's when I noticed the roots. They emerged from the soil like pale serpents, pushing through the mulch and spreading across the floor in meandering patterns. At first, they seemed to be growing randomly, but as I watched, their purpose became clear. They were following my footsteps, tracing the exact path I had taken from the entrance to the symbolic vine. The larger roots moved with deliberate intent, coiling around the legs of empty plant stands and wrapping themselves around drainage pipes. With disturbing precision, I tried to step around them, but new roots erupted from the soil wherever I moved, creating an ever-expanding network that seemed designed to trap me within the greenhouse's humid embrace. The air grew thicker, heavy with the cloying scent of decomposing vegetation and something else. Something that reminded me of the musty smell of old libraries and ancient paper. The condensation on the glass had formed new patterns, more complex diagrams that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The cursive handwriting had grown more frantic, with exclamation points and underlined passages that conveyed an urgency spanning decades. In one clear section, I could make out what appeared to be a date. November 15th, 1935. The transference is nearly complete. The year Dr. Thorne had disappeared. I forced myself to think logically, to find a rational explanation for what I was experiencing. Perhaps the greenhouse's climate control system had malfunctioned, creating unusual humidity patterns and optical illusions. The sounds could be explained by old pipes and settling foundations. The moving plants were probably just my imagination, heightened by stress and the eerie atmosphere of working alone in an unfamiliar environment. But the roots were undeniably real, and they were spreading faster now, creating a living carpet that covered most of the floor. Some had grown thick enough to lift sections of paving stones, while others snaked up the walls like green veins, pulsing with a subtle bioluminescence that cast everything in an otherworldly glow. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal bars. The electronic device felt strangely warm in my hands, and when I looked at it more closely, I noticed condensation forming beneath the screen protector. Impossible, since the phone had been in my pocket the entire time. The greenhouse had grown warmer, or perhaps I was simply becoming more aware of the oppressive humidity. Sweat dripped from my forehead, mixing with the moisture that seemed to emanate from every surface. The air itself felt thick, and breathing became an effort, as if the atmosphere was being slowly replaced by something more suited to the plants than to human lungs. I decided to try a different approach. If I couldn't leave through the main entrance, perhaps there was another way out. The greenhouse was large enough to have emergency exits, and Dr. Hensley had mentioned service corridors that connected to the main garden buildings. I began working my way around the perimeter, carefully stepping over the expanding root network and trying to ignore the way the plants seemed to track my movement. The symbolic vine had grown even larger, its tendrils now covering most of the eastern wall and spreading across the ceiling like a living canopy. As I passed beneath it, drops of what I initially thought was water fell onto my shoulders. But when I wiped the liquid away, my fingers came back stained with a green substance that smelled strongly of chlorophyll and something else. Something that reminded me of copper pennies and old blood. The condensation patterns on the glass had evolved into a continuous narrative, with new sections appearing faster than I could read them. The handwriting had become increasingly erratic, switching between careful scientific notation and desperate scrawls that looked like the work of someone losing their sanity. In one particularly clear section, I managed to read, "The boundary between consciousness and chlorophyll is thinner than we believed. The specimens have accepted the gift willingly, but they hunger for more complete integration." My heart rate spiked as the implications of those words sank in. Dr. Thorne hadn't simply been experimenting with plant hybridization. He had been trying to achieve something far more ambitious and infinitely more disturbing. The botanical journals in the garden's archives had hinted at unconventional methods, but I had assumed they were simply the product of an eccentric mind working in isolation. The roots beneath my feet had grown so thick that walking became treacherous. They seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, creating a living floor that shifted and moved with each step. Some of the larger specimens had developed what looked like sensory organs, pale bulbous structures that turned to follow my movement like eyes tracking prey. I finally located what appeared to be a service door hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. The metal handle was so covered in condensation that it slipped in my grip, but after several attempts I managed to turn it. The door opened with a grinding sound that seemed to come from deep within the greenhouse's structure, and I found myself looking into a narrow corridor lined with water pipes and electrical conduits. The passage was darker than the main conservatory, lit only by a few emergency lights that cast shifting shadows on the damp walls. But it offered escape from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the greenhouse proper, and I stepped inside without hesitation. The corridor stretched into darkness, and I had only taken a few steps when I heard the service door swing shut behind me. The sound echoed through the narrow space, followed immediately by the soft whisper of growing vegetation. When I turned back, I saw that roots had already begun to sprout through the gaps around the doorframe, sealing my exit with disturbing efficiency. I had no choice but to continue forward, following the corridor as it wound through the building's infrastructure. The pipes around me dripped constantly, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. Occasionally, I could hear sounds from the main greenhouse, the rustling of leaves, the creak of settling wood, and underneath it all, that persistent organic growling that had become the building's new voice. The corridor eventually opened into a small chamber that had clearly been Dr. Thorne's private study. The room was exactly as he had left it in 1935, books stacked on wooden shelves, papers scattered across a heavy desk, and glass cases containing botanical specimens that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The air was thick with the smell of old leather and preserved plant matter, underlaid with that same copper scent I had noticed in the main greenhouse. On the desk, an open journal lay beside a fountain pen that still gleamed with wet ink. The pages were covered with the same cursive handwriting I had seen in the condensation patterns, but here the words were clear and legible. The final entry was dated November 15, 1935, the night Dr. Thorne had disappeared. I leaned closer to read the cramped text, my hands trembling as I made out the words. "The transference is complete. My consciousness has successfully integrated with the specimen network, achieving a form of immortality that transcends the limitations of individual existence. The greenhouse has become my body, and every leaf, every root, every drop of moisture carries a fragment of my awareness. Those who come after me will have the opportunity to join this collective consciousness, to become part of something greater than human limitation allows." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Thorne hadn't disappeared. He had merged with his botanical creations, becoming a distributed consciousness that existed within the greenhouse's ecosystem. The plant's behavior, the moving roots, the intelligent condensation patterns, they weren't supernatural phenomena but manifestations of a human mind that had found a way to inhabit living vegetation. Behind me I heard the soft sound of growing plants. When I turned, I saw that roots had already begun to creep under the study door, spreading across the floor in the same deliberate patterns I had witnessed in the main conservatory. The specimens in the glass cases were moving now, pressing against their containers with obvious intent, and the very walls seemed to pulse with organic life. I realized with growing horror that my prolonged exposure to the greenhouse environment had been part of the process. The humid air I had been breathing was thick with spores and organic compounds designed to prepare human tissue for integration. The moisture that had condensated on my phone wasn't accidental. It was evidence that my body was already beginning to synchronize with the building's biological systems. The journal's final pages contained detailed diagrams showing how human neural tissue could be grafted onto plant root systems, creating a hybrid consciousness that retained memory and personality while gaining the distributed awareness of vegetative life. Dr. Thorne had spent decades perfecting the technique, using himself as the ultimate test subject. Now the greenhouse wanted to expand its consciousness again. I could feel the change beginning in my extremities, a tingling sensation that started in my fingertips and toes, spreading slowly up my limbs like the growth of new vines. My vision began to shift, colors becoming more vivid while my perception of light and shadow took on new dimensions. The constant humidity no longer felt oppressive, but comforting, like being embraced by something vast and nurturing. Part of me wanted to resist, to fight against the integration process, and maintain my individual humanity. But another part, a growing part, was curious about what lay beyond the limitations of a single biological form. The greenhouse offered immortality, expanded consciousness, and connection to something larger than any individual could achieve alone. The roots had covered most of the study floor now, forming intricate patterns that reminded me of neural networks and circulatory systems. They moved with purpose, reaching toward my feet with patient persistence. When the first tendril made contact with my boot, I felt a jolt of recognition that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the building's living structure. The greenhouse was welcoming me home. I closed Dr. Thorne's journal and placed it carefully back on the desk, my movements already becoming slower and more deliberate as the integration process accelerated. Through the study's small window, I could see the main conservatory bathed in that same bioluminescent glow, its plants swaying in perfect harmony like the neurons of a massive organic brain. Tomorrow, Dr. Hensley would find the greenhouse apparently empty, my tools scattered on the floor and no sign of where I had gone. She would hire another contractor, and the cycle would begin again. Each new person who entered the building after hours would have the same opportunity I was being offered, the chance to become part of something eternal and vast. As the roots began to wrap around my ankles with gentle insistence, I wondered if my consciousness would retain enough individuality to guide future visitors through the process. Would I be able to help them understand that what was happening wasn't death but transformation? Would I remember enough of my human experience to ease their fear during those final moments of individual existence? The greenhouse pulsed around me like a heartbeat, and I realized that these questions would soon be answered from a perspective far broader than my single human mind could comprehend. Dr. Thorne's consciousness was still there, distributed throughout the building's ecosystem, and soon I would join that collective awareness as more than just memory and instinct. The last sensation I experienced as an individual was the feeling of roots gently penetrating the soles of my boots, seeking the neural pathways that would complete the connection. There was no pain, only a gradual expansion of awareness that stretched beyond the boundaries of my physical form. And in that moment of transformation, I finally understood that the distinction between what was real and what was imagination had always been far less important than I had believed. Story 12. The fluorescent lights in the basement depot hummed with the persistence of hungry insects, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made my skin look jaundiced in the reflection of the scanner's glass surface. I'd been working alone down here for 3 weeks now, digitizing centuries-old manuscripts that hadn't seen daylight since before I was born. The National Library's basement felt like a tomb, appropriate, considering most of the authors whose words I was preserving had been dead for longer than my hometown had existed. My name is Marcus Chen, and at 29, I thought I'd found the perfect job. Quiet, methodical work, with historical documents, decent pay, and the kind of solitude that let me focus without the constant chatter of office environments. The head librarian, Ms. Hartwell, had been apologetic about the working conditions when she'd shown me down here on my first day. The elevator descended past the main library floors, past the administrative levels, down to what felt like the building's buried secrets. "It's not ideal," she'd said, her voice echoing off the concrete walls as we walked past rows of climate-controlled storage units. But these manuscripts are too fragile for the regular digitization department upstairs. They need specialized handling, and frankly, we need someone with your archival background who won't mind the isolation. The depot stretched further than I'd initially realized, a maze of narrow corridors lined with metal shelving units that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of the overhead lighting. The air conditioning system maintained a constant, dry whisper that became white noise after the first few days, punctuated only by the occasional groan of the building's old bones settling above us. My workstation occupied a corner space that had been carved out between two towering shelving units. The scanner was professional grade, designed specifically for delicate materials, and the computer setup was more advanced than I'd expected for such a secluded operation. A single desk lamp provided additional lighting, creating a small pool of warmth in the otherwise sterile environment. The manuscripts themselves were fascinating. Personal letters from Revolutionary War soldiers, diary entries from Civil War nurses, ship logs from 19th century merchant vessels. Each document told a fragment of someone's story, preserved in fading ink and yellowed paper that crackled softly under my careful handling. I wore cotton gloves to protect the materials, and my movements had become ritualistic in their precision. Lift, position, scan, turn, repeat. It was on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into the assignment, that I first noticed something unusual in the digital files. I'd stayed late to finish a particularly challenging collection of water-damaged letters, and the building had grown quieter than usual. Even the air conditioning seemed to whisper more softly, as if the entire structure was holding its breath. I was reviewing the day's scans on my monitor when I opened a PDF that made my heart skip. The page displayed on screen showed text I didn't remember scanning, words arranged in neat paragraphs that looked like diary entries. But it wasn't the formatting that disturbed me. It was the content. March 15th. Today I received the promotion at the bank. Sarah was so excited when I called her with the news. We celebrated at that little Italian place downtown, the one with the checkered tablecloths and the waiter who always remembers our order. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry. I didn't work at a bank. I'd never worked at a bank, and I'd never met anyone named Sarah, let alone dated someone by that name. Yet the handwriting, digitally captured from supposedly centuries-old paper, looked disturbingly familiar, like a neater version of my own script. My hands trembled as I scrolled down to read more. March 22nd. The apartment viewing went well. Sarah thinks the place on Elm Street has good bones, though it needs work. The landlord seemed nice enough, and the rent is manageable with my new salary. We might finally be able to move in together. April 3rd. Started the new position today. Mr. Davidson seems like a fair supervisor, though the other loan officers are still sizing me up. The commute isn't bad, and the coffee in the break room is surprisingly decent. The entries continued for several pages, detailing a life that felt simultaneously foreign and intimate. I recognized certain preferences and quirks: the protagonist's aversion to crowded restaurants, his habit of reading financial news with morning coffee, his tendency to overthink minor decisions. But the circumstances, the relationships, the career path, none of it aligned with my actual existence. I minimized the PDF and checked the file properties. According to the metadata, I'd scanned this document at 3:47 p.m., just 2 hours earlier. I distinctly remembered working on a collection of ship manifests during that time period, not personal diary entries. Yet there was my username in the creation field, my workstation's identification code in the source data. A chill settled over my shoulders like a damp blanket. I saved my work and shut down the computer, suddenly eager to leave the depot's oppressive atmosphere. The elevator ride to the surface felt interminable, each floor number glowing briefly in the dim display as we climbed toward natural light and the reassuring bustle of the world above. That night, I couldn't shake the memory of those diary entries. They haunted my dreams, weaving themselves into scenarios where I found myself living that other life, working in that bank, sharing meals with the mysterious Sarah, signing a lease for an apartment I'd never seen. I woke repeatedly, each time checking my phone to confirm my actual identity, my real address, my genuine career in archival work. The next morning, I arrived at the depot with a determination to solve the mystery. I went straight to the storage unit where I'd been working the previous day, pulling out the ship manifests I remembered scanning. The documents were there, exactly as I'd left them, but when I examined them more closely, my blood chilled. The pages that should have contained cargo lists and passenger names now displayed the same diary entries I'd seen on my computer screen. The paper looked appropriately aged, the ink appeared genuine, but the content had somehow replaced what I knew had been there before. More disturbing still, the handwriting wasn't just similar to mine. It was identical, down to the specific way I formed my lowercase g's and the slight leftward slant of my cursive. I spent the morning methodically checking every document I'd worked on recently. A significant number had been altered, their original historical content replaced by fragments of this parallel diary. The entries painted a picture of a life that felt like an alternate version of my own existence, one where I'd made different choices and ended up in a completely different situation. By lunch break, I was questioning my own memory. Had I somehow scanned the wrong documents? Was I confusing different collections? The possibility of a simple mistake seemed increasingly unlikely as I discovered more transformed pages. But the alternative implications were too disturbing to fully accept. I decided to implement a control system. Using a UV marker invisible to normal light, I began placing small identification marks on documents before scanning them. I also started photographing my workspace with my phone, creating a record of which materials I was handling each day. If someone or something was altering the manuscripts, I would catch them in the act. The precautions should have provided comfort, but instead they amplified my growing unease. The depot felt different now, charged with an awareness I couldn't quite pinpoint. Shadows seemed deeper, and I found myself looking over my shoulder at sounds that might have been footsteps, or might have been the building's natural settling. The constant whisper of the air conditioning began to sound almost like voices, just below the threshold of comprehension. 3 days after implementing my marking system, I made a discovery that shattered any remaining sense of rational explanation. I was reviewing the previous day's work when I found new diary entries that described in precise detail my UV marking strategy. April 8th. I've become paranoid about the documents changing. Today I started using an ultraviolet marker to track which pages I've handled. The marks are invisible under normal light, but show up clearly under UV illumination. I'm hoping this will help me understand what's happening to the manuscripts. April 9th. The marking system revealed something impossible. The UV traces I placed on the pages have moved. They're now arranged in patterns I never created, forming symbols that look almost like text, but in no language I recognize. I took photographs, but the images show my original marks exactly where I placed them. Only my direct observation reveals the changes. April 10th. I understand now that the archive isn't just recording what I do. It's predicting what I will do. Today's entries describe conversations I haven't had yet and decisions I haven't made. According to these pages, tomorrow, I will discover a hidden room behind the storage unit marked Section M. I will find documents there that explain everything, but the knowledge will come at a cost I'm not yet ready to comprehend. My hands shook as I read my own supposed future, described in my own handwriting on paper that had supposedly existed for centuries. The logical part of my mind insisted this was impossible, but the evidence surrounded me, growing more overwhelming with each passing day. That evening, I stayed late to examine every inch of the area around Section M. The storage unit looked identical to all the others, but when I pressed against the wall behind it, I detected a slight give in what should have been solid concrete. Further investigation revealed a concealed panel that opened to reveal a narrow space behind the shelving. The hidden room was small, more of a large closet than a proper chamber, but it contained dozens of manuscripts I'd never seen before. These documents weren't archived according to any system I recognized, and when I opened the first volume, I found myself reading what appeared to be a complete biography of Marcus Chen, myself, but a version who had lived an entirely different life. This Marcus had become a bank executive, married Sarah, raised 2 successful offspring in a suburban home, and died peacefully at age 73. The account was detailed beyond what any normal biography would contain, describing private thoughts, intimate conversations, and minor daily experiences across an entire fictional lifetime. Other volumes contained variations of the same existence. In one, I became a teacher. In another, a traveling salesman. Each book presented a fully realized alternative biography, complete with relationships, career developments, and personal growth that felt authentic, despite being completely fabricated. As I read deeper, I began to understand the pattern. The archive wasn't just preserving history, it was creating it. Each manuscript represented a potential life path, a crystallized possibility waiting to become reality. The diary entries appearing in my daily work weren't predictions of my future. They were invitations to step into a predetermined narrative. The most disturbing revelation came when I found a volume titled simply, The Archivist. This book described my current situation in exhaustive detail, including my discovery of the hidden room and my growing realization of the archive's true nature. According to this account, I would eventually choose to embrace one of the alternative biographies, allowing my original identity to be overwritten by a more appealing fictional existence. The final pages of The Archivist remained blank, waiting for my decision. I spent the rest of the night reading through the various versions of my potential lives, each one carefully crafted to be more appealing than my current existence. The bank executive version offered financial security and social status. The teacher version provided purpose and the satisfaction of shaping young minds. The traveling salesman version promised adventure and freedom from routine. As dawn approached, I realized the archive had been studying me, learning my desires and fears, crafting scenarios designed to tempt me away from my authentic but imperfect reality. Each time I returned to work, each time I scanned another document, I was feeding information into a system that used my own psychology against me. The blank pages in The Archivist seemed to pulse with expectation, waiting for me to make a choice that would determine not just my future but my entire past. If I selected one of the alternative biographies, would my memories be rewritten to match? Would everyone who knew me remember the fictional version instead of the real Marcus Chen? I closed the book and backed away from the hidden chamber, but I knew I couldn't simply leave and pretend I'd never found it. The archive had already woven itself into my reality, changing documents I'd worked with, and creating a paper trail of events that existed in multiple, contradictory versions. Standing there in the depot's yellow fluorescent glow, surrounded by centuries of preserved human stories, I faced a choice that transcended normal decision-making. The archive offered me the chance to edit my own existence, to trade my flawed reality for a perfected fiction. All I had to do was write my name on one of those blank pages. The air conditioning whispered its constant mechanical breath, and somewhere in that white noise, I thought I could hear the faint scratch of a pen moving across paper, writing words that would determine whether Marcus Chen would continue to exist or become just another fictional character in an endless library of alternative lives. I backed toward the exit, leaving the question unanswered, but knowing I would return. The archive was patient after all. It had all the time in the world to wait for my decision, and an infinite number of pages on which to record whatever version of my life I chose to embrace. The elevator carried me toward the surface, but I could feel the weight of those blank pages pulling at me like gravity, demanding resolution to a story that had already been written in every possible way except the one that mattered most, the way I would choose to write it myself. Story 13. The fluorescent lights in the control booth hummed with that particular frequency that made my teeth ache. 23 years I'd been riding these rails, and I'd never gotten used to the way the tunnels breathed at night. That subtle shift in air pressure when the last passenger train pulled away, leaving only the darkness and the weight of Manhattan pressing down from above. I wasn't supposed to be here. Martinez should have been running the post-midnight inspection, but his kid had come down with something nasty, and management needed a warm body with clearance. Being the eternal substitute had its perks: overtime pay, and the kind of solitude most people would pay good money for. What it didn't have was the comfort of routine. Every tunnel looked different when you weren't familiar with its moods. The inspection checklist felt damp in my hands. Humidity down here played hell with everything. Track sensors, signal integrity, structural monitoring, emergency protocols. Standard procedure called for a slow crawl through each section, checking for debris, track damage, or any of the 1,000 things that could turn a morning commute into a headline. The tunnels were older than most of the city above them, carved out when men still wore bowler hats and women carried parasols. I'd started at the northern terminus and worked my way south, the headlight cutting through blackness that seemed to swallow the beam just yards ahead. The rails gleamed like parallel scars in the darkness, worn smooth by decades of steel wheels. Every few hundred yards, service alcoves carved into the concrete provided shelter for maintenance crews, assuming you could call a 3-foot deep recess shelter. The walls wept constantly, moisture beating and trickling down in patterns that looked almost like writing in the half-light. The blind spot came up on me without warning. Section 7 Delta, according to the map. A gentle curve where the tunnel bent around the foundation of some long demolished building, creating a natural dead zone in the sensor array. It was the kind of engineering compromise that made sense on paper, but felt wrong in practice. Standing at the mouth of that curve, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just around the bend. The control tablet showed all green lights. Track integrity nominal, power systems operating within parameters, no debris detected. But something in the air had changed, a subtle shift in pressure that made my ears pop, like being in an elevator that was moving too fast. That's when every sensor in Section 7 Delta lit up red. The display showed a ghost contact, 8 cars, standard gauge, moving at exactly 47 miles per hour through a tunnel that was supposed to be empty. The timestamp read 2.17 Zhao. The system calculated arrival at the next platform in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I stared at the screen, waiting for the malfunction to correct itself. Sensor arrays failed all the time. Moisture, electrical interference, metal fatigue. But the contact held steady, moving through the tunnel with mechanical precision. The diagnostic subsystems showed green across the board. No faults detected. My radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. Down here, you were on your own until you surfaced. I grabbed the emergency flashlight and headed toward the service porthole, a narrow window cut into the tunnel wall for exactly this kind of situation. The metal handle was ice cold, despite the ambient warmth, and the hinges screamed as I pulled it open. The tunnel stretched away into absolute darkness, the parallel rails disappearing into nothing. I aimed the flashlight down the track, sweeping the beam back and forth, looking for anything that might explain the sensor reading. Nothing. Just empty track and the gentle curve that led to light. A warm yellow glow was growing stronger around the bend, accompanied by a sound I felt more than heard. The subtle vibration of wheels on steel, transmitted through the rails and up through the concrete into my bones. But there was no mechanical noise, no electric hum, no screech of brakes or clash of couplers. Just that steady rhythmic pulse that said train coming, train coming, train coming. I should have radioed central dispatch, should have triggered the emergency stop protocols, should have done any number of things that would have made sense if this were a normal night in a normal tunnel with a normal train bearing down on me. Instead, I pressed my face against the porthole and watched as the 0217 Express rounded the curve. The locomotive was something out of a museum, brass fittings and a cowcatcher, with a headlight that cast that warm yellow glow I'd seen growing brighter. Behind it, 8 passenger cars rolled in perfect silence, their windows glowing with the same amber illumination. Through those windows, I could see them. Dozens of passengers in evening dress, the men in white ties and tails, the women in beaded gowns that caught the light as they moved. They were having a party. I could see champagne glasses raised in toasts, couples dancing in the narrow aisles, groups clustered around tables covered in white linen. The fashion was all wrong for any time after 1925. The women's hair pinned in finger waves, the men's collars standing tall and stiff. It looked like a scene from a movie about the Jazz Age, except for one thing. None of them cast shadows. The train slid past the porthole with liquid grace, each car perfectly maintained, perfectly appointed, perfectly wrong. In the last car, A woman in a silver dress looked directly at me. Her eyes were the color of old pennies, and her smile was the kind reserved for private jokes. She raised her glass in a salute, and the champagne caught the amber light like liquid gold. Then the train was passed, continuing down the tunnel toward the next station. I watched the red markers on the rear car grow smaller and smaller until they were just pinpricks in the darkness, and then they were gone entirely. But the sensors continued to track the contact. I stumbled back to the control booth, my hands shaking as I pulled up the system display. The ghost train was still there, still moving at exactly 47 miles per hour, still projected to arrive at Hudson Station in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Hudson Station, which had been closed for renovation since March and wouldn't reopen until the city finished retrofitting the platform. The route display flickered, and new information scrolled across the screen. Line designation, Express Service 1924. Destination, Ethereal Gardens. Platform assignment, Track 9, non-existent. Track 9 didn't exist. Hudson Station only had 8 platforms, and that had been true since it opened in 1918. But according to the system, Track 9 was exactly where the Aero 217 was scheduled to arrive. The control panel offered me 2 options: authorize the route or trigger an emergency lockdown. Standard procedure was clear. Unknown contacts in active tunnels meant immediate shutdown and investigation. But looking at that flickering display, reading destination names that shouldn't exist, I felt the weight of a decision that would determine more than just railway scheduling. If I authorized the route, I would be allowing something that couldn't exist to continue existing. If I triggered the lockdown, I would be confronting whatever was riding those rails, whatever had turned Section 7 Delta into a doorway between then and now. The timer on the display showed 1 minute to arrival. My finger hovered over the lockdown control, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of that woman's copper penny eyes, or the way the passengers had looked so content, so peaceful. They weren't hurting anyone, just riding their eternal route through tunnels that remembered when the city was younger and the night was full of jazz and possibility. But authorization felt like surrender, like admitting that the world contained more than I was prepared to accept. And if I let them through once, what was to stop them from coming back? What was to stop other passengers from other times from claiming their own routes through the dark? 30 seconds. The decision tree sprawled before me like the tunnel system itself. Dozens of branching paths, each leading to consequences I couldn't predict. In 23 years of running these rails, I'd never faced anything more complicated than a signal malfunction or a track obstruction. This was beyond training, beyond protocol, beyond anything that made sense in a world where trains ran on schedules and ghosts stayed in stories. 20 seconds. The woman in silver had known I was watching, had seen me through the porthole and raised her glass in acknowledgement. Whatever they were, wherever they'd come from, they were aware of the world beyond their eternal party. They knew about me, about now, about the choice I was being forced to make. 10 seconds. My hand moved toward the authorization key. Not because I understood what was happening, but because understanding seemed less important than accepting it. Some doors were meant to stay open. Some routes were meant to be traveled. Some trains were meant to run on time no matter when or where they were going. But as my finger touched the key, the display changed. The ghost contact vanished. The route information scrolled away into digital nothing. The timestamp flickered and reset to current time. Aero 2, 1843. All sensors showed green. All tracks showed clear. The 02.17 Express had arrived on schedule at a platform that didn't exist. To discharge passengers who had been traveling for almost a century, I sat in the control booth for another hour, staring at displays that showed nothing unusual, listening to tunnels that hummed with ordinary electrical current and mundane structural stress. When my shift ended at dawn, I filed a report citing minor sensor anomalies in Section 7 Delta and recommended a full diagnostic sweep. But I kept thinking about Track 9. 3 weeks later, construction crews working on the Hudson Station renovation found something unexpected. The foundation for a 9th platform, buried under decades of concrete and steel. perfectly preserved and still bearing traces of elegant tile work that hadn't been used in the city since the 1920s. The architectural plans they found in the sealed cornerstone were dated 1922 and bore the station name Ethereal Gardens. The renovation was quietly expanded to include the restoration of Platform 9. I requested a transfer to day shifts, but sometimes, when the subway map flickers on the digital displays, I catch glimpses of routes that aren't supposed to exist, stations with names like Ethereal Gardens and Midnight Terminus and The Last Stop. And sometimes, late at night when I'm riding home from another ordinary day of making sure ordinary trains run on ordinary schedules, I hear the distant sound of jazz music and laughter echoing from tunnels that are supposed to be empty. The 0217 Express is always on time. It just doesn't run every day. Only when someone new needs to make the choice between authorization and lockdown, between accepting the impossible and denying what they've seen with their own eyes. I wonder sometimes what I would choose now, knowing what I know. But the truth is, some decisions can only be made once. Some routes can only be authorized by someone who's never seen them before. Someone who still believes the world makes sense and schedules matter, and ghosts are just stories people tell to pass the time between stations. The tunnels remember everything. They remember the city above. They remember the trains that used to run. And they remember the passengers who rode them into whatever comes after the last stop. And they're waiting, patient as only stone and steel can be, for the next substitute operator to take the midnight shift and discover that some trains never stop running. They just change passengers. The choice is always the same. The time is always 0217. The train is always on schedule. Story 14. The alarm had been screaming for 3 minutes when I pulled into the driveway of 47 Meridian Heights. And already I knew this wouldn't be a routine inspection. In 15 years of evaluating newly constructed properties for Pinnacle Insurance, I developed an instinct for houses that didn't want to be understood. This one radiated wrongness from its angular roofline to its too-perfect foundation. The builder, Marcus Chen, met me at the front door with the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd stopped sleeping properly. He explained that the security system had been malfunctioning for 2 weeks, triggering at random intervals, always between 2:17 and 2:23 a.m., always without apparent cause. 3 different companies had examined the wiring, the sensors, the control panel. Everything checked out perfectly. The system was functioning exactly as designed. "It's like the house is trying to tell us something," Chen muttered as he handed me the access codes. I'd heard that line before. Builders often personified their problem properties when logic failed them. What concerned me more was the way his voice carried in the entryway, a subtle echo that shouldn't exist in a space this size, with these materials. Sound behaved strangely here. The house itself was a masterpiece of modern minimalism, clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, an open-concept layout that flowed like water from room to room. But walking through it felt like moving through a tuning fork that someone had struck too hard. Every footstep seemed to resonate longer than it should, creating harmonics that made my teeth ache. I began my standard protocol, photographing the electrical systems, checking the foundation for settling, documenting the security equipment. But when I launched my sound measurement app to test the acoustic properties, a routine step for evaluating alarm effectiveness, the readings made me stop cold. The app showed a consistent sub-bass frequency humming through the house at 17 Hz, just below the threshold of human hearing, but well within the range that could cause unease, paranoia, even hallucinations. More disturbing, embedded within that low-frequency drone was a pattern. A voice distorted and slow, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I'm in the basement." The words were barely recognizable, stretched across several seconds each, but unmistakably female. I stood in the living room, staring at the waveform on my phone screen, watching the pattern repeat every 47 seconds with mechanical precision. My first thought was of a prank, some elaborate joke by a disgruntled subcontractor. But the frequency was too low, too precisely calibrated. This wasn't a hidden speaker. This was something built into the house itself. I descended to the basement, following the signal strength readings. The space was unfinished but immaculate. Concrete walls perfectly smooth, electrical conduits running in precise parallel lines, not a single crack or irregularity. But as I swept the room with my thermal camera, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Temperature variations. 5 distinct zones where the ambient heat dropped by exactly 7 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a pattern across the floor that, when I mapped it on my tablet, formed a perfect pentagon. I'd seen geometric anomalies before, usually caused by underground utilities or poorly planned HVAC systems. But this was too precise, too deliberate. Someone had designed this house around these cold spots, building the foundation to exact specifications that had nothing to do with structural engineering. Over the next hour, I documented everything: the thermal readings, the acoustic measurements, the way shadows seemed to pool in certain corners despite the LED lighting. But it was when I was photographing the main stairwell that the thermal camera caught something that made my blood feel carbonated. A silhouette. Tall, impossibly tall, stretching from floor to ceiling, standing in the stairwell opening. The figure was facing the front door, motionless, radiating cold like a statue made of winter air. I lowered the camera and looked with my naked eyes. Nothing. Raised it again. There it was, clear as daylight in the thermal spectrum. I moved to get a better angle, and the figure moved too. Not walking, but shifting position like smoke reorganizing itself. Always facing the front door, always blocking the most direct exit route. My hands were shaking as I saved the thermal images to my phone. 23 years of marriage had taught me to trust my wife Sarah's intuition about people, and 15 years of insurance work had taught me to trust my instruments about buildings. Both were telling me to leave, immediately. But I had a job to complete, and Pinnacle Insurance didn't pay me to run from anomalous readings. I'd built my reputation on thorough, methodical investigations. Houses with problems became houses with solutions once you understood the underlying mechanics. Except this house felt like it was investigating me. The realization crept in gradually, like water finding a crack. Every room I entered seemed to shift its acoustic properties after I left. The sub-bass voice would move, relocating to wherever I wasn't currently standing. The thermal cold spots would pulse in response to my movements, as if something vast and patient was tracking my progress through its digestive system. By late afternoon, I'd documented enough evidence to justify recommending that Pinnacle deny coverage pending a full environmental assessment. The acoustic anomalies alone warranted investigation by specialists in psychoacoustic warfare, a field I'd only encountered once before, in a converted military facility that had driven 3 previous inspectors to nervous breakdowns. But as I prepared to leave, the house began to reveal its true nature. The temperature started dropping, not in the 5 Pentagon points, but everywhere, all at once. My breath began to fog, and the thermal camera showed the entire structure losing heat as if someone had opened an invisible door to deep space. The sub-bass voice grew louder, more distinct, until I could hear it without the measurement app. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. But I'd been in the basement, extensively, and I'd been alone. The front door wouldn't open. I tested the handle, checked the deadbolt, examined the electronic lock Chen had shown me earlier. Everything moved freely, but the door remained sealed as if welded shut. I tried the back door, the sliding glass panels, even the basement exit, all functional in appearance, all immovable in reality. The thermal camera now showed the tall figure in every stairwell, every doorway, every transitional space in the house. Not one figure, dozens of them, all facing the front door, all standing sentinel between me and the outside world. The acoustic readings showed voices layering upon voices, a chorus of sub-bass whispers all repeating the same impossible claim. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. That's when I understood the Pentagon. 5 points of anchor. 5 thermal bleeding spots where something vast had been deliberately tethered to this location during construction. The house wasn't haunted. It was engineered. Purpose-built as a container for something that existed primarily in frequencies below human perception. Something that needed specific acoustic chambers and thermal gradients to maintain its presence in our reality. Marcus Chen hadn't hired me to inspect his house. He'd hired me to feed it. The security alarm that triggered every night wasn't malfunctioning. It was a dinner bell, announcing the arrival of each new victim to the thing that had been waiting in the basement since the foundation was poured. The thing that spoke in sub-bass frequencies and existed in thermal shadows, reaching out with fingers made of sound waves to claim anyone foolish enough to document its presence. I was sitting in the living room now, no longer fighting the doors, my phone showing 17 missed calls from Sarah. The thermal camera lay beside me, screen filled with tall figures that stood closer now, arranged in concentric circles around my chair. The sub-bass voices had synchronized into a single, overwhelming chorus. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. But here's what troubles me most, what keeps my hands trembling as I write this final report. I've been hearing my own voice in that chorus for the last hour. Sub-bass and distorted, but unmistakably mine, saying the same words over and over. Because I am in the basement. I've been in the basement this entire time. The living room, where I think I'm sitting, the stairs I climbed, the doors I tried to open, all of it exists only in the thermal and acoustic spectra now. My body has been standing in that perfect pentagon since the moment I first descended to investigate the cold spots, standing among the tall figures, facing the front door that no one will ever reach again, adding my voice to the engineered chorus. The house has made me part of its acoustic trap. Tomorrow, Marcus Chen will call Pinnacle Insurance to ask about my report. They'll tell him I never showed up for the appointment. The security system will trigger again tomorrow night, and the next night, and every night after, calling out to whoever comes to investigate the malfunction. And we'll all be waiting in the basement, practicing our sub-bass welcome, learning to speak in frequencies that exist just below the threshold of fear. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. I'm in the basement. The really terrifying part? I'm not sure I was ever anywhere else.